When two 6-year-old twins knocked on Margaret Wells' door that freezing November evening in 1891, she expected beggars or lost children. Instead, they delivered words that would shatter her solitary world. "We heard you need a man on the ranch. Our papa loves you." Margaret had never met their father. She'd spoken to no one about her desperate situation. Yet these children knew her secrets, and they'd come with an offer that felt like salvation wrapped in danger. What followed wasn't a rescue. It was a reckoning. Stay with me until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The wind that November evening didn't whisper, it screamed. It tore across the Montana plains like something wounded and furious, rattling the bones of Margaret Wells's ranch house and testing every nail, every shingle, every weak point in the structure she'd been struggling to hold together for 8 months. Inside, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a ledger she couldn't balance and a lamp that flickered with each gust, threatening to plunge her into darkness that felt increasingly permanent. She was 32 years old, a widow, alone on 200 acres of land that her late husband Thomas had built from nothing but sweat and stubbornness. The land was good, rich soil, decent water, protected valleys where cattle could winter without too much loss. Thomas had known what he was doing, but Thomas had been thrown from a horse in March, broken his neck, and left Margaret with assets she didn't fully understand and debts she understood too well. The ledger told a story she'd read a dozen times, hoping the numbers would somehow change. They never did. She owed money to the bank. She owed money to the feed supplier. She owed money to the man who'd helped with the spring branding back when she still thought she could manage this alone. The cattle were healthy, but she'd need help moving them to winter pasture. The hay barn needed repairs before the serious snow came. The well pump made a grinding sound that spoke of expensive problems lurking just beneath the surface. And she was alone. Thomas's hired men had drifted away within weeks of his death. Some had been respectful about it, hat-in-hand apologies about needing steady work. Others had simply vanished, unwilling to take orders from a woman or unwilling to work for someone they assumed would fail by summer's end. She tried to hire replacements, but men either wanted wages she couldn't afford or looked at her in ways that made her keep her rifle closer than she should have needed to. Margaret pressed her palms against her eyes, feeling the grit of exhaustion behind them. She'd been up since before dawn, trying to reinforce the fence line in the north pasture where something, wolves maybe, or just time and weather, had weakened the posts. Her hands were raw despite her gloves, and her shoulders burned with an ache that had become so constant she barely noticed it anymore. The wind shrieked again, and something metallic clattered in the yard, probably the bucket she'd left by the pump. She should go secure it. She should do a lot of things. Instead, she sat in her kitchen, staring at numbers that spelled failure, and felt something she hated feeling: defeat. That's when the knocking came. Not a timid tap or a hesitant rattle. 3 solid, confident knocks that cut through the wind's howl and made her head snap up. For a moment, she didn't move, her heart suddenly hammering in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with fear. People didn't come calling after dark. Not out here, not without reason. The knocking came again, still firm, still deliberate. Margaret stood, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. She reached for the rifle leaning against the wall near the stove. Thomas's rifle, well-oiled and loaded, because she'd learned quickly that being a woman alone meant being ready for trouble. She held it low but ready as she approached the door. "Who's there?" Her voice came out stronger than she felt. "Please, ma'am." A child's voice, high and clear despite the wind. "We need to talk to you. It's important." A child? Margaret hesitated, her grip on the rifle loosening slightly. What child would be out here miles from town in this weather? She moved to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to see the porch. 2 small figures stood there, bundled in coats too large for them, their faces barely visible in the lamplight spilling from her window. Children. Girls, by the look of them. Identical, standing so close together, they might have been one person split in 2. Margaret's fear shifted into something more complicated, concern mixed with confusion. She set the rifle aside but kept it within reach as she unlatched the door. The wind immediately tried to tear it from her hands, and the 2 girls rushed inside with a gust of cold air that made the lamp flame dance wildly. She slammed the door shut and turned to face her unexpected visitors. They were perhaps 6 years old, Identical twins with dark braids escaping from woolen caps, round faces pink from cold, and eyes so similar it was dizzying, a deep brown that reflected her lamplight like polished stones. They wore boys' trousers under their oversized coats, practical boots caked with mud, and expressions far too serious for children their age. "What on earth?" Margaret started, but the girl on the left spoke first. "We heard you need a man on the ranch." Her voice had the kind of certainty that belonged to adults, not children. "Our papa loves you." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She actually took a step backward, her hand instinctively reaching for the table to steady herself. "What did you say?" The second girl, the one on the right, nodded gravely. "Papa talks about you. He says you're brave and strong and trying real hard. He says you deserve help." Margaret's mind spun. She'd never, not once in her entire life, seen these children before. She would have remembered. Twins were uncommon enough, but identical twins with that kind of presence? Impossible to forget. "Who—" She had to stop, clear her throat, try again. "Who is your papa?" "Daniel Cross," the first girl said. She pulled off her cap, and her braids tumbled down. "I'm Lila. This is Rose." "Rose," the second girl confirmed, also removing her cap. Daniel Cross. The name meant nothing. Margaret searched her memory frantically, trying to place it. Had Thomas known him? Had she met him in town and forgotten? But no, she was good with names, and she'd met every rancher, every merchant, every hired man within 50 miles during her time here. Daniel Cross wasn't one of them. "I don't know your father," Margaret said carefully, her eyes moving from one identical face to the other. "I've never met a Daniel Cross." "That's because he's careful," Lila said. "He doesn't push himself where he's not wanted. But he's been watching, not in a bad way," she added quickly, perhaps seeing the alarm in Margaret's expression. "In a protecting way, making sure you're safe." The words should have frightened her. A strange man watching her property? A man she'd never met claiming to care about her? But something in these children's faces, in their absolute conviction and the absence of any deception in their eyes, gave her pause. "Your father has been watching my ranch," Margaret repeated slowly, testing the words, trying to make them make sense. "Helping," Rose corrected, "not just watching. Did you notice the fence posts in the north pasture got fixed last week?" Margaret's breath caught. She had noticed. She'd gone out one morning to find 3 posts that had been leaning dangerously, now standing straight and true, the earth packed solid around them, the work done so neatly it looked professional. She'd thought, well, she hadn't known what to think. She'd half convinced herself she'd remembered them being worse than they were. "That was your father?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "And the hay barn door that was sticking," Lila added. "He planed it down so it swings easy now. And the loose shingles on your porch roof, and the—" "Stop." Margaret held up her hand, her mind reeling. All those little repairs she'd noticed over the past few weeks, the small improvements she'd attributed to luck or her own faulty memory. Someone had been on her property, working while she slept, fixing things without asking for payment or acknowledgement. "He wouldn't let us come before," Rose said, her voice softer now, almost apologetic. "He said you needed to know you could do it yourself first, that you needed to be strong on your own before you'd accept help. But Lila and I convinced him you're strong enough now. You proved it, so we came." "You convinced him?" Margaret looked between them, these 2 small girls who spoke with the wisdom of old women. "Where is he now?" "Nearby," Lila said. "Waiting to see if you'll talk to him. He won't come unless you say it's okay. He's respectful like that." Margaret moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside fully now, scanning the darkness beyond her porch. The wind had died down slightly, enough that she could make out the shapes of her barn, her lean-to, the split-rail fence that marked her front yard. But no figure emerged from the shadows. No man stepped forward to reveal himself. "I don't see anyone," she said, still looking out. "He's there," Rose said with complete confidence. "Papa's always there when we need him." Margaret let the curtain fall and turned back to the twins. They'd moved closer to her stove, their small hands extended toward the warmth, and she noticed for the first time how thin they were beneath their bulky coats. Not starved, nothing that dramatic, but lean in a way that spoke of meals stretched thin, of portions carefully rationed. "When did you last eat?" she asked, the question coming out before she'd fully thought it through. The girls exchanged a glance. "Breakfast," Lila admitted. "We had cornmeal mush. It was good." That was 12 hours ago. Margaret moved to her pantry, her mothering instincts overriding her confusion and caution. She had stew left from her own dinner, still warm on the stove. She'd made too much, as she often did, unable to break the habit of cooking for two. "Sit." They obeyed without argument, climbing onto chairs that made them look even smaller, their feet dangling well above the floor. Margaret ladled stew into bowls, sliced bread from yesterday's loaf, poured milk from her cold box. She set the food before them and watched as they attacked it with the efficient focus of genuinely hungry children, though they remembered their manners enough to use their spoons properly and say thank you between bites. As they ate, Margaret studied them more carefully. Their clothes were clean but patched in multiple places. Their boots were good quality but worn, probably bought second-hand. Their hair had been braided with care. Someone loved these children enough to tend to them properly, but they had the look of kids who'd learned early to take care of themselves, who didn't expect adults to solve all their problems. "Where's your mother?" Margaret asked quietly, sitting down across from them. Rose's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "She died when we were babies. We don't remember her." "It's just been us and Papa since then," Lila added. "He does real good with us. He taught us to read and write and do sums, and to ride and shoot, and—" She stopped abruptly, as if realizing she'd said too much. "And to fix things," Rose finished. "Papa can fix anything." Margaret absorbed this, her mental image of Daniel Cross slowly coming into focus, a widower raising twin daughters alone, a man with skills and intelligence. Teaching them to read was no small thing. A man careful enough not to push where he wasn't wanted, but bold enough to help anonymously. A man who, according to these children, loved her. That last part still made no sense. "Why did you say your father loves me?" she asked, keeping her voice gentle. "If we've never met—" "You don't have to meet someone to love them," Lila said with the kind of simple certainty only children possessed. "Papa says love isn't just about being close. It's about seeing who someone really is and caring about what happens to them." "He sees you working so hard," Rose continued. "He sees you not giving up even when you're tired. He says you have a light in you that won't go out no matter how hard the wind blows." Margaret felt something crack open in her chest, something she'd kept carefully locked since Thomas died. These words, delivered by children who had no reason to lie, speaking of a man she'd never met who somehow saw her, really saw her. Not as a woman failing at a man's job, not as a widow to be pitied or dismissed, but as someone with worth, with strength, with light. She had to stop, swallow against the sudden tightness in her throat. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say nothing yet," Lila said practically. "We just wanted you to know you're not alone. That help is here if you want it. Papa's the best worker you'll ever find, and he doesn't ask for much. Just a fair wage and maybe—" She paused, glancing at her sister. "Maybe a chance," Rose finished, "for all of us to be a family." The boldness of it stunned Margaret into silence. These children had walked through a storm to her door to propose. What exactly? That she hire their father? That she marry him? That she take on a ready-made family when she could barely keep herself fed? The practical part of her mind started raising objections immediately. She didn't know this man, hadn't spoken one word to him. For all she knew, he could be dangerous, unstable, using his daughters as bait for some scheme she couldn't foresee. The fact that he'd been on her property without permission should have alarmed her more than it did. But another part of her, the part that had noticed those repaired fence posts and felt a surge of gratitude, the part that had woken the past few mornings feeling slightly less alone than the morning before, that part wanted to believe these children, wanted to believe that help had arrived not because she was weak, but because she was strong enough to accept it. "Your father," she said slowly, thinking through each word. "He's waiting outside in the cold?" "He's used to cold," Lila said. "He won't mind." "I mind." Margaret stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "No man waits in the cold while his daughters are warm inside. You tell him—" She paused, reaching for the rifle again, not to threaten, but to be safe. You tell him to come to the door. I'll talk to him. But I'm armed and I'll stay armed, and if I don't like what I see, he leaves and doesn't come back. Clear? Both girls nodded solemnly. Rose slid off her chair and went to the door, opening it just enough to lean out. Margaret couldn't hear what she said. The wind swallowed the words, but she saw the girl's mouth move, saw her gesture back toward the house. Then Rose stepped back, and a man filled the doorway. He was tall. Margaret's first impression, tall enough that he had to duck slightly to enter. Broad across the shoulders in a way that spoke of hard physical labor, but lean, like the twins, as if he stretched every meal to make sure his daughters ate their fill. His face was weathered, lines around his eyes that came from squinting against sun and wind, a jaw covered in several days' worth of dark stubble. His hair was black with threads of silver at the temples, longer than was fashionable, pulled back with a leather cord. But it was his eyes that held her. Brown like his daughters, but deeper, sadder, carrying a weight she recognized because she carried it too. The weight of loss, of responsibility, of keeping going when stopping would be easier. He removed his hat as he entered, revealing more of that dark hair, and stood just inside the door as Rose shut it behind him. He didn't move further into the room, didn't presume. His hands, large, scarred from work, held his hat carefully, and his eyes found Margaret's face and stayed there, not wandering, not assessing her home or possessions, but focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Mrs. Wells," he said, and his voice was low, rough from disuse, but respectful. "My name is Daniel Cross. I apologize for the intrusion. My daughters can be determined." "We're not sorry," Lila said from the table. "You needed to meet her, Papa." "Lila," he said quietly, and she subsided, though her expression remained defiant. Margaret tightened her grip on the rifle, not raising it but making sure he could see it. "Your daughters say you've been helping on my ranch, without my knowledge or permission." "Yes, ma'am." He didn't try to justify it or explain it away. "I have." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving hers. "Because you needed help and weren't getting it. Because I have skills going to waste. And because—" He paused, seemed to struggle with the words, then continued with simple honesty. "Because watching you work yourself to death was harder than I could bear." "You don't know me," Margaret said, but her voice came out softer than she intended. "I know you better than you think." He glanced at his daughters, then back to her. "I know you check your fence lines every morning before dawn. I know you sing sometimes when you're working in the barn, old hymns mostly. I know you saved a calf that got stuck in the creek last month, even though it meant you were soaked and freezing. I know you keep your husband's rifle clean and loaded, but hope you never have to use it. I know you're afraid, but you don't let that stop you." Each observation landed like a small shock. He had been watching, carefully, consistently, learning her patterns, her habits, her character. It should have felt invasive. Instead, it felt like being seen for the first time in months. "That's—" Margaret struggled for words. "That's not normal, Mr. Cross." "No, ma'am, it's not." He held her gaze steadily. "But nothing about this situation is normal. You're a woman alone on a ranch in country that eats weak people. I'm a man with skills and no work, and daughters who need stability. We're both trying to survive in a world that isn't set up for people like us. So maybe normal isn't what we need." "What do you need?" The question came out before Margaret could stop it. "Work," he said simply. "Fair wages if you can afford it, food and shelter if you can't, a chance to prove I'm useful, and—" his voice softened. "A reason to stay in one place. My girls need a home. I'm tired of drifting. And what do I get besides your labor? Everything fixed that's breaking, everything maintained that's wearing down. Someone to handle the heavy work you shouldn't be doing alone. Someone who knows cattle and horses and land." He paused. "Someone who'll stand between you and trouble when it comes." "You think trouble's coming?" "I know it is." His expression darkened. "You have good land, Mrs. Wells, valuable land, and you're alone. There are men in town who've noticed both those things, men who think a widow will fold under pressure. I've heard talk." Margaret's stomach clenched. She'd sensed the side glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. But hearing it confirmed, hearing that her vulnerability was being actively discussed and calculated, made anger rise sharp and bright in her chest. "Who?" she demanded. "Don't matter yet," Daniel said. "What matters is that you need help, and I'm offering. Take me on a trial basis. 1 month. I'll work, you'll watch, and at the end of 30 days you decide if I stay or go. No obligations beyond that. No promises required." It was a reasonable offer, more than reasonable. And yet, "Your daughters said you love me," Margaret said, the words tumbling out before she could reconsider them. "Is that true?" Daniel Cross's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes deepened. "My daughters speak more plainly than most adults find comfortable. But yes, Mrs. Wells, in my way, I do. Not the way a man loves a woman he's courted, but the way a man loves courage when he sees it, the way he loves determination and strength and refusal to quit. I've watched you fight for this land, and I've come to care what happens to you. If that's love, then yes. If it's something else, then that's what it is. But my feelings don't obligate you to anything." Margaret stared at this strange, honest man who stood in her kitchen with his daughters watching and his hat in his hands, and his heart apparently on his sleeve. Everything in her practical mind said this was madness. Inviting a stranger to work her land, trusting children's assurances, believing in help that came from nowhere. But her heart, battered and exhausted as it was, recognized something real in Daniel Cross. Something that matched the ache in her own chest. The loneliness. The determination. The simple human need to matter to someone, to be seen and valued for more than just the work you could do or the land you owned. 1 month, she heard herself say. Trial basis. You sleep in the bunkhouse, you eat at your own table, we maintain boundaries and propriety. At the end of 30 days, I decide if you stay. Understood. And your daughters? Stay with me, he said firmly. Where I go, they go. We're a unit. They'll need schooling. I teach them. They'll need... Margaret paused, looking at Lila and Rose, who were watching this exchange with identical expressions of hope. They'll need to be children sometimes, not just workers. Yes, ma'am. Daniel's voice softened. I'm aware. Margaret lowered the rifle at last, her decision made, even though her mind was still spinning with the implications. There's blankets in the bunkhouse and firewood stacked outside it. Get yourselves settled tonight. We start work at dawn tomorrow. Before dawn, Daniel corrected gently. I know your schedule. Despite everything, the fear, the confusion, the sheer strangeness of this entire situation, Margaret felt her mouth quirk in something almost like a smile. Before dawn, then. Daniel moved toward the door, gesturing for his daughters. They came immediately, though Lila paused to look back at Margaret. Thank you for the stew. It was the best thing we've had in weeks. You're welcome. Margaret found she meant it. You'll have breakfast in the morning. Come to the house at 5. Yes, ma'am, they chorused. Daniel ushered them outside, but he paused in the doorway himself, turning back to face Margaret. Mrs. Wells, I won't let you down. I promise you that. Mr. Cross, she said quietly, people break promises all the time. I'm not interested in words. Show me through work. He nodded, something like respect crossing his features. Yes, ma'am. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving Margaret alone in her kitchen with the lingering smell of stew and the echo of children's voices and the strange, unsettling feeling that her life had just shifted on its axis in a way she couldn't yet fully comprehend. She moved to the window and watched as 3 figures crossed her yard toward the bunkhouse, the man's tall form flanked by 2 smaller shadows that matched his stride. The lamp she'd left burning in the bunkhouse earlier, always prepared for the hired help she hadn't been able to afford, flickered to life, and she saw their silhouettes moving behind the oiled paper window covering. A family. On her land. Under her employ. In her life. Margaret returned to her table and her ledger, but the numbers looked different now. If Daniel Cross could work like he implied, if he could handle the heavy repairs and the cattle management and the 100 other tasks she'd been trying to juggle alone, then maybe, just maybe, she could make this work. She could keep Thomas's land. She could survive the winter. She could prove to the town and to herself that a woman alone wasn't automatically a woman defeated, But that wasn't what made her hand shake slightly as she closed the ledger and extinguished her lamp. What made her tremble was simpler and more complicated at once. For the first time since Thomas died, she wouldn't wake up tomorrow morning alone. She climbed the stairs to her bedroom, removed her boots and work dress, and lay down in the bed that had felt too large and too cold for 8 months. Outside, the wind had gentled to something almost peaceful. From across the yard, she heard the low murmur of a man's voice and the lighter tones of children responding. A father putting his daughters to bed, telling them stories or prayers or simple good nights. The sound shouldn't have comforted her. She didn't know these people, didn't know if she could trust them, didn't know if this was salvation or the beginning of a different kind of disaster. But she fell asleep to the sound of other people breathing nearby, and for the first time in months, she didn't dream of being alone on an endless plain with winter closing in and no help coming. Instead, she dreamed of fence posts standing straight, of barn doors swinging easy, of small repairs made by careful hands in the darkness. She dreamed of being seen. When she woke at 4:30 the next morning, before the sun had even considered rising, she dressed quickly in the cold room and descended to her kitchen. She built up the fire in her stove, set coffee to brew, and started making breakfast, more than she needed for herself, which felt strange and right at once. At 5 o'clock exactly, a knock came at her door. Not the bold knocking of the night before, but something more tentative, more respectful of boundaries. Margaret opened it to find Daniel Cross and his daughters standing on her porch, the darkness behind them absolute, but the lamp in her kitchen casting them in warm light. "Good morning, Mrs. Wells," Daniel said quietly. "Good morning, Mr. Cross." Margaret stepped aside. "Come in, breakfast is ready." As they filed inside, the girls shy now in daylight's approach, the man still careful and contained, Margaret realized she'd crossed a threshold she couldn't uncross. Whatever happened next, whether this arrangement lasted 30 days or 30 years, she'd made a choice. She'd opened her door to strangers in the night, and now they were part of her story. She closed the door against the pre-dawn cold and turned to face her unexpected household. Daniel stood by the stove, his daughters on either side of him, and all three looked at her with expressions that mixed hope and uncertainty and determination. "Let's eat," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the way her heart hammered. "We have a lot of work ahead of us." And as she served breakfast to people who'd been strangers 12 hours ago, as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky and reveal the land that was both her burden and her inheritance, Margaret Wells felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt ready. Whatever came next, the work, the town's reaction, the complications of this strange arrangement, she would face it, not alone anymore. Not rescued, but perhaps finally partnered. The knock at her door last night had been unexpected, unsettling, impossible to predict. But maybe, she thought as she watched Daniel Cross bow his head and quietly bless the food while his daughters clasped their small hands together, maybe that's exactly what she'd needed. Something impossible, something that refused to follow the rules. Something, or someone, brave enough to step forward when everyone else had stepped back. Outside, the ranch waited. The work waited. The winter and its challenges waited. But for this moment, in her warm kitchen with the smell of coffee and bacon filling the air, and voices other than her own breaking the silence she'd lived in for too long, Margaret let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she'd be able to face it all. Not alone. Never alone again. The first week passed in a blur of work that felt both familiar and entirely new. Margaret had spent 8 months laboring alone on her ranch, her days measured in fence posts mended and water hauled, and 1,000 small tasks that left her exhausted but never quite finished. Now, with Daniel Cross working beside her and his daughters helping where they could, the same tasks somehow multiplied and divided simultaneously. More hands meant more could be done, but also more awareness of everything that had been neglected, everything that needed attention. Daniel worked like a man possessed by purpose. He was on the property before Margaret woke each morning, despite her own early rising, and she'd find evidence of his industry in small details. The gate that had been sticking now swung smoothly, the water trough scrubbed clean of algae, firewood split and stacked near her kitchen door. He never asked permission for these tasks, never sought acknowledgement, simply saw what needed doing and did it. It should have irritated her, this assumption of authority over her property. Instead, she found herself grudgingly grateful. Thomas had been the same way. a man who measured his worth in solved problems rather than spoken promises. The similarity comforted and unsettled her in equal measure. By the fourth day, they'd fallen into a rhythm. Breakfast at 5 in Margaret's kitchen, the four of them eating in a silence that gradually became less awkward and more companionable. Then work. Daniel handling the heavy repairs while Margaret managed the livestock and the accounts, with Lila and Rose shuttling between them, helping where small hands could be useful. They learned quickly, these twins, absorbing instructions with an intensity that suggested they'd been trained from birth to make themselves indispensable. "Papa taught us to earn our keep," Lila explained one afternoon while helping Margaret sort through the seed supply for spring planting. The girl's small fingers worked with surprising dexterity, separating damaged seeds from viable ones with a practiced eye. "He says people who don't work don't eat, and people who eat without working lose their souls piece by piece." Margaret glanced at the child, startled by the philosophical weight of the statement. "That's a harsh way to see the world." "Is it wrong?" Lila looked up, her dark eyes serious. "Papa says the truth isn't always gentle, but it's always better than pretty lies." "Your father says a lot of things, apparently." "He thinks a lot of things," Rose added from the other side of the table, where she was mending a harness strap with stitches too neat for a 6-year-old. "Most people don't think much at all," he says. "They just do what they've always done and wonder why nothing changes." Margaret set down the seed packet she'd been examining and studied both girls carefully. They wore simple dresses today. Margaret had found some of her own childhood clothes in a trunk and altered them to fit, unable to bear seeing the twins in their patched trousers and oversized coats every day. The dresses were faded but clean, and both girls had accepted them with a grave politeness that suggested they weren't accustomed to gifts. "Do you like it here?" Margaret asked, the question emerging before she'd fully considered it. "On this ranch, I mean. Are you happy?" The twins exchanged one of their frequent wordless communications, that eerie, silent conversation that identical siblings sometimes shared. Then Lila spoke, her voice soft but certain. "We're happier than we've been in a long time, Mrs. Wells. Papa smiles more here. He doesn't have that look in his eyes like he's already thinking about the next place we'll have to go." "What look?" "The sad look," Rose said simply. "The one that says nothing ever lasts. But here," she paused, her needle stilling in the leather, "here he looks like maybe he believes we could stay." The words lodged somewhere in Margaret's chest, painful and warm at once. She'd been so focused on her own survival, her own desperate scramble to keep her land and her dignity intact, that she hadn't fully considered what this arrangement might mean to Daniel and his daughters. They weren't just workers she'd hired. They were people as displaced and uncertain as she was, looking for the same thing she'd been seeking for months, a place to belong, a reason to believe the struggle was worth it. That evening, after the twins had gone to the bunkhouse, and Margaret was cleaning up from supper, Daniel appeared at her kitchen door with a brace of rabbits he'd snared in the north pasture. "Thought you might want these for stew," he said, holding them up. "The snares I set are catching regular now. Should provide good supplemental meat through the winter." "You set snares on my land?" Margaret took the rabbits, trying to decide if she should be annoyed or impressed. "Yes, ma'am. Should have asked first." He didn't sound particularly apologetic. "But you needed the meat more than you needed the formality." "You have an answer for everything, don't you, Mr. Cross?" "Not everything." His expression remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or challenge. "Just the things that matter." Margaret hung the rabbits on the hook by her pantry and turned back to face him. He stood in her doorway, neither fully in nor fully out, maintaining the boundaries they'd established even as the boundaries themselves began to feel increasingly arbitrary. They'd worked side by side for days now, shared meals, coordinated tasks, yet they still maintained this careful distance, this formal politeness that acknowledged the strangeness of their situation. "The fence line in the east pasture," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "You said it needed reinforcing." "It does. Whole section is compromised. I can have it done in 3 days if the weather holds, but I'll need to buy wire in town." He paused. "Which means people will see me. They'll ask questions." Margaret had been avoiding this inevitability, but she couldn't delay it forever. "What will you tell them?" "The truth. That I'm hired help. That you needed a worker and I needed work." His gaze held hers steadily. Unless you want me to say something different. No, the truth is fine. She wiped her hands on her apron, a nervous gesture she couldn't quite suppress. People will talk regardless. Let them talk. Daniel's voice carried an edge she hadn't heard before, something sharp beneath the usual measured calm. People who work don't have time to gossip. People who gossip don't have time to work. You know which kind matters. Easy to say when you're not the one being talked about. Mrs. Wells, I've been talked about since my wife died, and I didn't have the good sense to give my daughters to an orphanage or a relative like a proper widower. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I know exactly what it's like to be judged by people who think they know your situation better than you do. The difference is, I stopped caring what they thought about 5 years ago. Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of this man. He wasn't just offering her labor and protection. He was offering the solidarity of someone who'd already survived the scrutiny she was only beginning to face. Someone who'd chosen a harder path and learned to walk it without apology. I'll give you money for the wire, she said quietly. And Daniel... She stopped, realizing she'd used his first name for the first time. He noticed too, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Thank you for the rabbits and the work. And she gestured vaguely, encompassing everything she couldn't quite articulate. All of it. You're paying me for the work, Mrs. Wells. No thanks needed. Margaret, she said, the decision made in the moment she spoke it. If I'm calling you Daniel, you should call me Margaret. He considered this, and for a moment she thought he might refuse, might insist on maintaining the formality that kept them safely distant from each other. Then he nodded slowly. Margaret it is, then. He touched the brim of his hat. I'll head into town at first light. Be back by noon. After he left, Margaret stood in her kitchen with the rabbits hanging near her shoulder and the lingering echo of her name in his rough voice, and wondered what exactly she was doing. This was supposed to be a business arrangement, temporary and transactional. But something about the way Daniel said her name, the way his daughters had begun leaving wildflowers on her porch step, the way meals had started to feel less like obligations and more like gatherings, all of it suggested they were building something more complicated than employer and employee. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like a door opening in a house she'd thought had no more rooms to discover. The next morning, Daniel left for town with Margaret's money and a list of supplies she'd carefully written out. She watched him ride away on his worn but well-kept horse, and then turned her attention to the work that never ceased demanding attention. The twins helped her muck out the barn, their small voices filling the space with chatter about a nest of mice they'd discovered, and whether they should leave it alone or relocate the mice to the grain shed where they might actually be useful. Leave them, Margaret decided. If we move them, the mother might abandon the babies. Better to let nature take its course. That's what Papa says too, Rose said, leaning on her pitchfork. A child-sized one Daniel had fashioned from a broken handle and cut-down tines. That you can't fix everything, and trying to usually makes things worse. Though sometimes you have to try anyway, Lila added, always ready to provide nuance to her sister's statements. Papa says knowing when to help and when to step back is the hardest wisdom to learn. Your father is very wise. Margaret hauled another forkful of soiled hay toward the wheelbarrow. Did he go to school? He reads all the time, Rose said. Books about farming and animal husbandry and philosophy and history. He says education isn't about sitting in a building, it's about staying curious. He taught himself? Margaret paused in her work, genuinely interested now. Mostly. Lila's face shadowed slightly. After Mama died, he said he had to become twice as smart to be both parents. So he read everything he could find. He taught us the same way. Says we're already smarter than most adults he meets. I don't doubt it. Margaret smiled at them both. You're remarkable children, you know that? They ducked their heads in unison, pleased but embarrassed by the compliment. Margaret returned to her work, but her mind stayed on Daniel Cross and the picture that was slowly emerging of who he was. A self-taught widower raising brilliant daughters in poverty rather than give them up. A man who'd turned his grief into determination and his isolation into philosophy. No wonder the twins spoke of him with such devotion. He'd given them everything he had. Daniel returned just after noon as promised, his horse loaded with supplies. But his expression as he dismounted told Margaret immediately that something had happened in town. "What is it?" she asked, meeting him at the barn where he'd begun unloading. He glanced at the twins, who were watching from the barn entrance, then back to Margaret. "Girls, go check the water levels in the south pasture troughs. Take your time." They obeyed without question, and once they were out of earshot, Daniel turned to face Margaret fully. His jaw was tight, his eyes hard in a way she hadn't seen before. "You've got a problem," he said bluntly. "Man named Caleb Morton. He's been spreading word around town that you're going to fail, that your land will be up for auction come spring. He's positioned himself to buy it cheap when you default on your debts." Margaret's stomach dropped. Caleb Morton owned the ranch bordering her northern property line, a sprawling operation that had grown steadily over the past decade through a combination of shrewd dealing and, if rumors were true, occasional intimidation of smaller landowners. She'd met him twice, once at Thomas's funeral where he'd offered his condolences with eyes that assessed her property more than her grief, and once in town where he'd suggested she sell to him before things get difficult. She'd refused, politely but firmly. Apparently he hadn't accepted that refusal as final. What exactly is he saying? Margaret heard her own voice come out flat and hard. That you're a woman playing at ranching, that you've got no idea what you're doing, that hiring a drifter with 2 kids proves your desperate and poor judgment. Daniel's expression darkened further. He's suggested that I'm probably taking advantage of you, that maybe I'm after more than just wages. Heat flooded Margaret's face. Anger, not embarrassment. "What did you say?" "Nothing that got me arrested." Daniel began unloading wire with sharp, controlled movements that betrayed his fury. "Told him my employment arrangements were between you and me and he could choke on his opinions." "But Margaret, he's not just talking. He's laying groundwork. Getting people used to the idea that you'll fail, so when he moves against you, it seems inevitable rather than aggressive." "Moves against me how?" "Don't know yet, but men like Morton don't spread rumors without purpose. He wants your land, and he's preparing the town to accept whatever method he uses to get it." Daniel set down the wire and faced her directly. "You need to be ready for trouble. Real trouble, not just gossip." Margaret felt the familiar weight of isolation pressing down on her again, that sense of being alone against forces larger than herself. But then she looked at Daniel's face, at the genuine concern there, the readiness to fight if needed, the solid presence of someone who wasn't going anywhere, and realized she wasn't alone anymore. Whatever Morton was planning, she'd face it with help. "What do you suggest?" she asked. "First, we make sure everything on this ranch is documented and legal. Your deed, your loan agreements, any contracts or obligations. If Morton's going to come at you legally, we need to know exactly where you stand." "My papers are in order. Thomas was meticulous about that." "Good. Second, we make this place too successful to fail. If Morton's telling people you can't manage, we prove him wrong so thoroughly that his predictions become jokes." Daniel's eyes gleamed with something almost fierce. "We work harder than he expects. We make improvements that can't be ignored. We show the whole town that you're not just surviving, you're thriving." "And third," Margaret sensed there was more. "Third, we watch. Morton didn't build his empire by being stupid or straightforward. If he wants your land and talking doesn't work, he'll try something else. We need to be ready for whatever that is." Margaret nodded slowly, her mind already cataloging her assets and vulnerabilities. The ranch was in decent shape now thanks to Daniel's work, but winter would test them. If they could make it through to spring with the herd intact and the property improved, she'd be in a strong position to pay down her debts and prove her viability. But winter was long and unpredictable, and Morton would know that as well as she did. "He'll try to sabotage us," she said, thinking aloud. "Small things at first, things that could look like accidents or bad luck." "Most likely." Daniel's expression turned calculating. "Which is why we start sleeping in shifts. I'll take nights. I'm used to light sleeping anyway. Anything moves on this property after dark, I'll know about it. You can't stay awake all night and work all day. Watch me." His voice left no room for argument. "My daughters sleep in that bunkhouse, Margaret. Nobody threatens them, and anybody coming after you has to go through me first. I'll sleep when I'm dead." The fierce protectiveness in his voice struck something deep in Margaret's chest. This man, this near stranger who'd walked into her life less than 2 weeks ago, was ready to sacrifice his own rest to keep her safe. Not because she'd asked him to, not because she was paying him enough to justify it, but because somewhere in his private calculations of what mattered, she and her land had become worth defending. "Daniel," she said quietly, "why are you really here? And don't tell me it's just about work. You could find employment anywhere. Why my ranch? Why me?" He was silent for a long moment, his hands still on the wire, his gaze distant. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was sharing something he rarely voiced aloud. "After my wife died, I spent 5 years drifting, working enough to feed my girls, moving on before anyone could get close enough to matter. Told myself it was better that way, safer for them if we stayed mobile, unattached. But Lila and Rose, they're getting older. They need stability. They need to know what home feels like." He paused, then met her eyes. "I was passing through this territory 3 months ago, heard about Thomas Wells dying and leaving his widow alone. Heard the talk about whether you'd make it, and I thought—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "I thought, here's a woman fighting for something real, something worth having. And I thought if she's strong enough to fight alone, maybe she's strong enough to accept help. Maybe that's the kind of person who could give my daughters a real home." "You've been watching me for 3 months?" Margaret didn't know whether to be alarmed or moved. Not watching like a stalker, watching like a man trying to decide if he's found something worth staying for. Daniel's voice roughened slightly. "I've been disappointed by people my whole life, Margaret. My own family threw me out when I married wrong. My wife's family blamed me for her death. Most folks I've met see a poor widower with twin daughters and think burden before they think person. But you—" He gestured at the ranch around them. "You look at hard work and see possibility. You look at my daughters and see children, not inconveniences. You're willing to take a chance on a stranger because you know sometimes the only way forward is through the impossible. That's rare. That's worth protecting." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She'd spent so long feeling inadequate, feeling judged and found wanting, that hearing someone speak of her with such clear-eyed respect undid something in her chest. "I'm not as strong as you think I am," she managed. "You're stronger." Daniel's voice was absolute certainty. "You just haven't had anyone to tell you that in a while." Before Margaret could respond, Lila's voice called from across the yard. "Papa! The mare in the south pasture is favoring her left front leg." The moment broke, and Daniel was moving immediately, his long stride eating up the distance. Margaret followed, grateful for the interruption, needing time to process what he'd just revealed. They found the mare standing with her weight shifted awkwardly, her ear flicking in pain. Daniel approached slowly, speaking in low tones that calmed the anxious horse, and ran his hands down her leg with practiced gentleness. "Stone bruise," he announced after a moment. "Not serious, but needs wrapping and rest. She'll be fine in a week." "I'll get the supplies," Margaret said, but Rose was already running toward the barn where they kept the medical kit. As Daniel wrapped the mare's hoof with clean cloth soaked in a poultice he'd mixed from ingredients Margaret hadn't known she had, she watched his hands work. Large and scarred, but infinitely careful, moving with the confidence of someone who'd done this 100 times. Down. The mare stood still under his touch, trusting him completely. "You're good with animals," Margaret observed. "Animals are honest," Daniel said without looking up. "They don't lie or manipulate. If you treat them right, they trust you. If you treat them wrong, they let you know. People could learn a lot from animals. Is that why you prefer their company?" "I prefer the company of people who act like this mare, straightforward and honest." He finished tying off the wrapping and straightened, patting the horse's neck. "I found there aren't as many of those as there should be." That evening, as the sun dropped toward the mountains and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Margaret stood on her porch and surveyed her land. The fence lines were straight. The barn door hung true. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse chimney where Daniel was making supper for his daughters. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, and the repaired water troughs gleamed wetly in the slanting light. 2 weeks ago, this same view had filled her with despair. Now it filled her with something else. Not quite hope, not yet confidence, but a possibility she hadn't felt since Thomas died. The possibility that she might actually survive this, that she might keep her land and her independence, that she might not have to choose between safety and self-respect. A figure appeared at the bunkhouse door, Daniel, silhouetted against the lamplight inside. He didn't wave or call out, just stood there for a moment looking toward her house. Margaret raised her hand in acknowledgement, and after a pause he did the same. It was a small gesture, barely worth noting. But in that moment, Margaret felt something settle in her chest, a recognition that whatever was developing here between her land and Daniel's presence, between her solitude and his partnership, it was becoming something neither of them had quite planned for. Something that felt dangerously close to belonging. She went inside and prepared for bed, but sleep came slowly. Her mind churned with thoughts of Caleb Morton and his schemes, of Daniel's watchful presence and his daughter's gentle integration into her daily routine, of the way her life had pivoted on the axis of a single night when two small girls knocked on her door and offered her the impossible. Outside, she knew Daniel would be settling into his vigilant half-sleep, ready to wake at any unusual sound. The thought should have felt intrusive, a man guarding her property, monitoring her space. Instead, it felt like the first deep breath she'd taken in months. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever Morton was planning, whatever the town thought about her unconventional household, she'd face it with more resources than she'd had 2 weeks ago. More than just physical help, she had allies now. People who'd chosen to stand with her not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Margaret closed her eyes and let exhaustion finally claim her, and for the second time since Daniel Cross arrived, she didn't dream of losing everything. She dreamed instead of fence lines that held strong, of children laughing in her yard, of a man's voice saying her name like it was worth something. She dreamed of survival that looked less like desperation and more like life. The first threat arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under Margaret's door while she slept. She found it when she came downstairs to start breakfast. A single sheet of cheap paper with words scrawled in crude block letters. "Leave while you can. Women don't belong here." Margaret's hands didn't shake as she held it, though her pulse quickened. She'd been expecting something like this ever since Daniel's warning about Caleb Morton, but the reality of seeing those ugly words, of knowing someone had crept onto her porch in darkness, made her anger burn bright and cold. Daniel was at the barn already. She could see lamplight through the gaps in the boards. She crossed the yard with the note in her fist, her nightgown tucked into her work trousers, not caring how she looked. He was measuring out feed when she entered, and he turned at her footsteps, his expression shifting immediately when he saw her face. What happened? He set down the scoop and came toward her. She handed him the note without speaking. His jaw tightened as he read it. Then he turned the paper over, examining it carefully in the lamplight. Cheap paper, the kind you can buy at the mercantile for a penny a sheet. Writings deliberately disguised, all capitals, probably written with the left hand by someone right-handed. See how the letters slant wrong? He looked up at her. You didn't hear anything last night? Nothing. I slept through. Margaret felt a flash of guilt, as if she'd failed some test. I should have been more careful. You were exhausted. You can't stay alert every moment. Daniel's voice was steady, but his eyes had gone hard. This is my fault. I was watching the barn and the pastures, didn't think they'd be bold enough to approach the house. It's not your fault. It's whoever wrote this filth's fault. Margaret took the note back, folding it precisely. I'm keeping this. Evidence, in case we need it. We'll need more than a threatening note to prove anything against Morton. Daniel moved to the barn door and looked out at the pre-dawn darkness. But this changes things. They're escalating faster than I expected. Usually it starts with talk, moves to minor sabotage, then threats. This is jumping straight to intimidation. Maybe they're more desperate than we thought. Margaret followed his gaze, scanning the yard that suddenly felt less safe than it had yesterday. Or maybe they're testing me, seeing if I scare easily. Do you? Daniel asked quietly. No. The word came out flat and certain. I'm angry, not afraid. There's a difference. Something like approval flickered across Daniel's face. Good. Fear makes people stupid. Anger, properly directed, makes them dangerous. He turned back to her. From now on, I sleep in your house. Not in your room, he added quickly, seeing her expression. but downstairs where I can hear if anyone approaches. The girls can stay in the bunkhouse. They're safer there, less visible. But you're the target here, and I need to be closer. Margaret wanted to argue, to insist she didn't need that level of protection, but she recognized the practicality of his suggestion. The parlor has a settee. It's not comfortable, but I've slept in worse places than a settee, Margaret. Believe me. They told the twins at breakfast, presenting it as a simple change in routine rather than a response to danger. Lila accepted it with her usual grave practicality, but Rose studied her father's face with an intensity that suggested she understood more than they were saying. "Someone's trying to hurt Mrs. Wells," Rose said quietly. It wasn't a question. Daniel didn't insult her intelligence by denying it. "Someone's trying to scare her. There's a difference. And they're going to fail." "We'll help," Lila said immediately. "We can watch during the day while you work. We're small. People don't notice us, but we notice them." Margaret felt a surge of protectiveness toward these fierce little girls who'd adopted her cause as their own. "Absolutely not. You're children. You're not getting involved in—" "We're already involved," Rose interrupted, showing a boldness she rarely displayed. "We live here. If someone threatens you, they threaten our home too, and we're not helpless just because we're young." "Rose," Daniel's voice carried a warning note, but also something else, pride perhaps, or recognition. "It's true, Papa. You taught us to stand up for what matters. Well, this matters." Rose looked between her father and Margaret, her chin set stubbornly. "We're not asking permission to care about Mrs. Wells. We're telling you we already do." Margaret found she had no words for the emotion lodging in her throat. These children, who'd known her barely a month, were ready to stand with her against threats they didn't fully understand. She glanced at Daniel and saw her own feelings reflected in his expression, gratitude and worry tangled together. "You can watch," Margaret said finally, "but you tell your father or me immediately if you see anything unusual. You don't approach strangers. You don't take risks. Understood?" Both girls nodded solemnly, and the conversation moved to safer topics. The day's work schedule, the need to check the cattle in the northern pasture, the supplies running low in the pantry. But the threat hung in the air like smoke, invisible but present, changing the taste of everything. 3 days passed quietly. Too quietly, Daniel said. He prowled the property each evening like something caged, checking locks and sightlines, positioning himself each night on Margaret's settee with his rifle within reach. Margaret found herself hyper-aware of every sound, the wind rattling windows, mice in the walls, the normal settling noises of an old house that suddenly seemed sinister. Then on Friday night, the barn caught fire. Margaret woke to Daniel's hand on her shoulder and his urgent voice cutting through sleep. "Fire! The barn! Get dressed and stay in the house." She was moving before fully conscious, pulling on clothes in the dark while her mind screamed denials. Not the barn, not the hay stored for winter, not the equipment and supplies they couldn't afford to replace. She reached the window and saw orange light flickering through the darkness, heard the first frightened sounds of animals stirring. Daniel was already gone, his footsteps thundering down the stairs. Margaret grabbed a shawl and followed, ignoring his order to stay inside. By the time she reached the yard, he'd already thrown open the barn doors and was leading out her 2 remaining horses, their eyes rolling white with fear. "Get them to the far pasture," Daniel shouted over the growing roar of flames. "Then start pumping water. We need to wet down the house and bunkhouse before sparks carry." Margaret grabbed both horses' leads and ran, her bare feet finding rocks and frozen ground, but not caring, focused only on getting the animals to safety. Behind her, she heard Daniel shouting for his daughters, and then Lila and Rose appeared from the bunkhouse in their nightclothes, already moving with purpose toward the well. The barn was fully engulfed by the time Margaret returned from securing the horses. Flames shot through the roof, illuminating the whole yard in hellish orange light. The heat was tremendous, even from 50 feet away. She joined the twins at the well, forming a bucket brigade that felt pathetically inadequate against the inferno, but was all they had. Daniel emerged from the barn leading the milk cow, his face blackened with smoke, coughing violently. "That's all of them. The rest is lost. Focus on containment now. Keep everything else wet." They worked through the night in a kind of desperate rhythm. Pump, carry, throw, repeat. The well was good and deep, thank fortune, and the water kept flowing. Margaret's arms screamed with exhaustion. Her hands blistered where the bucket handles rubbed, but she didn't stop, couldn't stop. The barn was gone. She'd accepted that within the first 10 minutes, but the house could be saved. The bunkhouse could be saved. They could survive this if the fire didn't spread. Somewhere around 3 a.m, the barn collapsed inward with a groan of breaking timber and a shower of sparks that shot into the night sky like demonic fireflies. Margaret's heart collapsed with it. All her hay, all her tools, all the supplies she'd carefully accumulated, gone in a matter of hours. But the fire began to die then, having consumed everything it could reach, and with Daniel's relentless wetting of the surrounding structures, it found nothing new to feed on. By dawn, only smoking ruins remained where the barn had stood, and Margaret's household stood in the yard covered in soot and exhaustion, staring at the destruction. "Deliberate," Daniel said flatly, breaking the silence. "Fires don't start themselves in the middle of the night in November. Someone set this." "Morton?" Margaret's voice came out harsh with smoke and fury. "Probably, or someone working for him." Daniel wiped his face, leaving clean streaks through the soot. "We need evidence. Once things cool enough, I'll search the rubble. There might be traces of accelerant, maybe something the arsonist left behind." "What do we tell people?" Lila asked. She and Rose stood close together, their faces pale beneath the grime. "When they ask about the fire?" "The truth," Margaret said. "That someone burned down my barn. Let them try to convince the town it was an accident. Let them explain how a stone barn with no working lanterns catches fire on a cold night with no lightning." As the sun rose fully, revealing the full extent of the damage, neighbors began arriving. Margaret watched them come with a mixture of hope and cynicism, wondering who was genuinely concerned and who had come to confirm her failure. The first was John Hendricks, who owned the property to her east, a solid man in his 50s with kind eyes and a practical manner. "Margaret," he said, dismounting quickly, "we saw the smoke at dawn. What happened?" "Someone burned my barn." She said it directly, watching his reaction. His face darkened. "Deliberately? You're sure?" "Certain as I can be without catching them in the act." Hendricks looked at the ruins, then back at her. "Anyone hurt?" "No. We got the animals out. Lost everything else." "You'll need supplies." Hendricks didn't ask, simply stated it as fact. "I've got hay you can buy at cost. And my son's good with timber work. I'll send him over next week to help rebuild." The simple practical kindness nearly undid Margaret's composure. "John, I can't pay much right now." "Didn't ask you to pay immediately. You're good for it, and that's enough." He glanced at Daniel, who stood slightly behind Margaret, his presence clearly protective. "Your hired man seems capable." "He is," Margaret said firmly. "I'd have lost everything without him." "Then you're fortunate." Hendricks tipped his hat. "I'll have that hay delivered by this afternoon. And Margaret, you need to report this. I know Sheriff Coleman isn't much, but it should be on record." After he left, others came, some genuinely helpful, some clearly fishing for gossip. Margaret answered the same questions repeatedly, maintained her composure, and tried to read who she could trust in the faces that came and went. Most were appropriately shocked, but she noticed a few whose surprise seemed performative, rehearsed. By mid-morning, Caleb Morton himself arrived, riding up on a black gelding that probably cost more than Margaret's entire remaining livestock. He was a large man in his 50s, well-dressed in a way that deliberately showcased his wealth, with a face that might have been handsome before greed had hardened it into something calculating. "Mrs. Wells," he said, dismounting with careful dignity, "I heard about your tragedy. I came to offer my condolences." "Your condolences." Margaret let the words hang in the air, flat and skeptical. "These are dangerous times for a woman alone." Morton's eyes swept the property, lingering on the destroyed barn. "Accidents happen, equipment fails. It's a hard life, ranching." "That wasn't an accident, Mr. Morton. That was arson." "Arson is a serious accusation." Morton's expression shifted into something meant to look sympathetic, but came across as patronizing. "Are you certain? Sometimes exhausted people forget to extinguish lanterns properly. No shame in that." "There were no lanterns in the barn," Daniel said, stepping forward. His voice was level but carried an edge that made Morton's gaze shift to him for the first time. And even if there had been, stone doesn't burn unless someone helps it along with accelerant. Morton studied Daniel with the same assessing look he'd given Margaret at Thomas's funeral. "You must be the hired help. Cross, is it? Daniel Cross? And you must be the neighbor who's been spreading rumors about Mrs. Wells's inevitable failure." A flash of anger crossed Morton's face before he could smooth it away. "I don't know what you're referring to. I've simply expressed concern about whether a widow can manage such a substantial property alone." "She's not alone," Daniel said quietly. "That's what seems to bother you." The two men faced each other in a silence that crackled with tension. Margaret felt the urge to intervene, to diffuse the confrontation, but something held her back. This was a necessary moment, a line being drawn, positions being declared. Morton needed to understand that intimidating her would mean going through Daniel, and Daniel needed to establish that he wasn't some easily dismissed hired hand. "Mr. Cross," Morton finally said, his voice dripping false courtesy, "you should be careful about making accusations you can't prove. People in these parts don't take kindly to drifters stirring up trouble." "And people everywhere don't take kindly to arsonists and land thieves," Daniel replied. "Funny how that works." Morton's jaw tightened, and for a moment Margaret thought he might actually strike Daniel. But then he seemed to remember himself, remember the audience of neighbors still lingering in the yard, and he smoothed his expression back into something pleasant. "Mrs. Wells," he turned to her, dismissing Daniel entirely, "my offer stands. I'll buy this property for a fair price, more than fair given your current circumstances. You could relocate somewhere easier, somewhere more suitable for a woman of your—" "No." Margaret cut him off. "I'm not selling. Not to you, not to anyone. This is my land, and I'm keeping it." "Pride is expensive, Mrs. Wells, especially when your barn is ashes and winter is coming." Morton's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Think about it. My offer won't last forever." He remounted and rode away, and Margaret watched him go with her hands clenched into fists. She knew what that had been. Not an offer, but a threat. Sell or face more accidents. Surrender or be destroyed. The ultimatum was clear, even if the words had been dressed in false politeness. "He'll try again," Daniel said quietly, once Morton was out of earshot. "This was a warning shot. Next time will be worse." "Let him try." Margaret's voice shook not with fear, but with rage. "I'll die before I give that man my land." "You might." Daniel turned to face her fully. "That's what you need to understand, Margaret. Morton has money and influence. He can afford to be patient, to escalate slowly. He can make your life hell in ways that never quite cross the line into obvious criminality. And if you fight him, he might decide it's worth the risk to move beyond warnings." "Are you telling me to sell?" She searched his face, dreading his answer. "I'm telling you what you're up against, what we're all up against, because make no mistake, if you stay, my daughters and I are in this fight too." His expression was grave. "But no, I'm not telling you to sell. I'm telling you to be smart about how you fight back." "How do we fight back against someone who burns barns in the night?" "By catching him doing it." Daniel's eyes gleamed with something dangerous. "By getting evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. By making him sloppy enough to give us what we need to destroy him legally instead of physically. You have a plan. The beginning of one." He glanced toward the twins who were helping clean up debris, then back to Margaret. "But it's risky, and it requires you to trust me completely." Margaret thought about the past month, about this man who'd proven himself in 100 small ways and several large ones, about his daughters who'd woven themselves into the fabric of her days, about the way he'd run into a burning barn to save her animals without hesitation, about the fury in his voice when he'd confronted Morton, not just defending her property, but defending her dignity. "I trust you," she said. "What do we need to do?" Over the next several days, Daniel worked with methodical intensity on 2 parallel tracks. During the day, they cleared the barn debris and began planning for a rebuild, making a visible show of resilience and determination. But at night, after the twins were asleep, Daniel and Margaret strategized. "Morton will escalate," Daniel explained, spreading out a rough map of the property he'd drawn. "The fire was meant to break you financially and psychologically. When it didn't work, when you refused to sell, he'll try something else. My guess is he'll target your livestock next. Can't run a ranch without cattle. So we guard them more carefully. We do better than that. We make it easy for him. Daniel tapped the map where he'd marked the northern pasture. We move most of your herd here. Visible, apparently vulnerable. But we set up observation positions where someone could watch without being seen, and we wait for him to make his move. That's using my cattle as bait. It's using the situation as bait. The cattle will be safe. I'll make sure of that. But Morton needs to believe he has an opportunity, and when he takes it, we'll have witnesses and evidence. Daniel met her eyes. It's a risk. I won't pretend otherwise. But doing nothing is a bigger risk. He won't stop until you're gone, or he's stopped. Margaret studied the map, her mind working through the implications. You're talking about spending nights in the cold, waiting for something that might not happen. I've spent nights in worse conditions for worse reasons. Daniel's voice was matter-of-fact. And I won't be alone. John Hendricks offered to help. I spoke with him yesterday. He's disgusted by what happened and willing to serve as a witness if we catch Morton or his people in the act. You've been planning this. I've been planning for various contingencies since the moment I arrived. Daniel folded the map carefully. I told you, Margaret, I don't do things halfway. If I'm here, I'm all in. That means protecting you, protecting this land, and protecting my daughters by making sure we have a stable home. Morton threatens all of that. The plan was set in motion over the following week. The cattle were moved to the northern pasture with obvious effort, making sure people in town would hear about the relocation. Margaret made trips to the mercantile and mentioned casually how vulnerable she felt with the barn gone and her livestock scattered. She played the part of a woman barely holding on, letting people see her exhaustion and worry. It felt like defeat, this performance of weakness. But Daniel reminded her it was strategy, not surrender. Let them think you're breaking, he said. Let Morton think his tactics are working. That's when he'll get confident. That's when he'll make mistakes. Meanwhile, Daniel, Hendricks, and occasionally Hendricks' grown son took turns watching the northern pasture from concealed positions. They rotated shifts to avoid exhaustion, maintained absolute silence, and waited. Days passed with nothing. Then a week. Margaret began to wonder if Morton had changed his tactics, if the bait had been too obvious. Then, 2 weeks after the fire, on a moonless night that seemed designed for secrecy, Daniel burst into Margaret's house at 2 a.m. They're here, he said, his voice urgent but controlled. 3 men, cutting your fence. Hendricks is watching them, but I need you to ride for the sheriff. Now, we need official eyes on this before it escalates. Margaret was already moving, pulling on boots and grabbing her coat. The twins are safe in the bunkhouse with all the lanterns lit. Anyone approaches, they start screaming, but they'll be fine. These men are after cattle, not children. Daniel pressed something into her hand, a piece of cloth. One of them dropped this. It's got Morton's ranch brand embroidered on it. Hendricks saw it in his spyglass. Margaret looked at the cloth, her heart hammering. Evidence. Real tangible evidence linking Morton to the crime. This could be coincidence. He could say they stole it, that it's a plant, not with 3 witnesses and a written confession. Daniel's smile was grim. I'm about to have a very persuasive conversation with whoever's cutting that fence. By the time you get back with the sheriff, we'll have everything we need. Daniel, if you hurt them, I won't start violence, but I'll finish it if they do. His expression softened slightly. Trust me, Margaret, this is what needs to happen. Now go. She went, riding through the darkness with her heart in her throat, pushing her horse harder than she should have, but unable to stop herself. The sheriff's house was 5 miles away, and every minute felt like an eternity. What was happening back at her ranch? Was Daniel safe? Were the twins really secure, or had she left them vulnerable? Sheriff Coleman was not pleased to be woken at 2:30 in the morning, but Margaret's urgency and the evidence she showed him, the branded cloth, convinced him this was serious. He dressed quickly, deputized his nephew, who lived next door, and rode back with Margaret through the pre-dawn darkness. They reached the northern pasture as the eastern sky was just beginning to pale toward gray, and there, caught in the growing light like actors on a stage, was a scene that would change everything. 3 men sat on the ground with their hands tied behind them, looking variously angry, frightened, and resigned. Daniel stood over them with his rifle, calm and watchful. John Hendricks was there too, along with his son, both armed and grim-faced. and on the ground between them lay cut fence wire, cattle prods, and a can of kerosene. "Sheriff Coleman," Daniel said evenly. "Glad you could make it. We've had quite an educational conversation here while we waited." The sheriff dismounted slowly, taking in the scene with an expression that suggested he was already calculating the political implications. "What exactly happened here?" "These gentlemen were caught cutting Mrs. Wells' fence, apparently planning to drive her cattle through and scatter them." Daniel gestured to the evidence. "The kerosene suggests they intended to make it look like another accident. Spooked cattle, maybe, knocking over a lantern. We stopped them before they could complete their work." "That true?" The sheriff looked at the three men. Two stayed silent, but the third, younger than the others and clearly terrified, broke almost immediately. "We were just doing what we were paid for. Mr. Morton said it would be easy, that nobody would catch us. He said, 'Shut up, you idiot,' one of the others hissed. But it was too late. The confession had been spoken aloud, heard by 5 witnesses, including the sheriff. Coleman's expression hardened. "You're saying Caleb Morton paid you to sabotage Mrs. Wells' property?" "He paid us for the fire, too," the young man continued, words tumbling out in his panic. $200 split 3 ways. Said he'd give us another 100 if we finished this job. Said he wanted the widow gone before Christmas so he could buy the land cheap." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the cattle seemed to sense the weight of the moment, standing motionless in the growing light. Margaret felt something unlock in her chest. Not quite relief, not quite triumph, but a fierce vindication that made her want to cry and shout at once. "I'm going to need that in writing," Sheriff Coleman said finally. "And then we're paying a visit to Caleb Morton." The sun was fully up by the time they finished taking statements. The 3 men were loaded into the sheriff's wagon, the evidence carefully collected and documented. Margaret stood with Daniel as the sheriff prepared to leave, her exhaustion so complete she felt almost drunk with it. "This goes to trial," Coleman said to her quietly. "And with this testimony, Morton's finished. He'll lose everything, his reputation, probably his land if the judge is harsh. You did this right, Mrs. Wells, proper and legal." After he left, Margaret turned to Daniel. He looked as exhausted as she felt, his face pale beneath the grime, his eyes bloodshot from sleepless nights. But he was smiling, a small, satisfied smile that suggested he'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. "You planned this," Margaret said. "All of it. The bait, the waiting, even getting that confession. You knew exactly how it would play out." "I hoped. I didn't know." Daniel set down his rifle, stretching muscles clearly stiff from hours of tension. "But yes, I planned for various outcomes. This was the best possible one. Legal justice instead of frontier justice. No blood spilled except in pride." "Thank you," Margaret said, and the words felt entirely inadequate for what he'd done. "For everything. For protecting my land, my livestock, my—" Her voice cracked slightly. "My future." "Your future was never in question," Daniel said quietly. "You'd have found a way to survive even without me, but I'm glad I could make it easier." "Ah." He paused, his eyes searching her face. "Margaret, I need to tell you something." Before he could continue, Lila and Rose came running from the direction of the bunkhouse, still in their night clothes but wide awake and clearly informed about the night's events. "Did they catch the bad men?" Rose demanded. "Are they going to jail?" "They're caught," Margaret confirmed. "And yes, they're going to jail. Your father was very brave tonight." "Papa's always brave," Lila said matter-of-factly. "That's just who he is." Daniel caught Margaret's eye over his daughters' heads, and something passed between them, a recognition, perhaps, that this moment marked a shift, that what had begun as a business arrangement had become something deeper and more complicated, something that felt dangerously close to family. But that conversation would wait. For now there was only exhaustion and relief, and the rising sun painting the Montana sky in shades of gold, illuminating land that was hers and would stay hers, protected by people who'd chosen to stand with her when standing alone had proven impossible. Margaret looked at Daniel Cross and his daughters, these people who'd knocked on her door 7 weeks ago and changed everything, and felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. She felt like she'd won. The courthouse in Helena was crowded the morning of Caleb Morton's trial. Margaret hadn't expected such attendance, hadn't realized how many people had been watching her struggle, waiting to see if a widow could truly hold her ground against a man like Morton. She sat in the front row with Daniel beside her, his presence solid and steadying, while Lila and Rose stayed with John Hendrick's wife back at the ranch. The girls had wanted to come, had argued passionately that they deserved to see justice served, but Daniel had been firm. A courtroom was no place for children to witness what men became when their masks finally slipped. The judge was a stern-faced woman in her 60s named Eleanor Blackwood, appointed by the territorial governor and known for her uncompromising interpretation of law. Margaret had heard stories about Judge Blackwood, how she'd once sentenced her own nephew to 6 months hard labor for cattle theft, how she tolerated no nonsense from lawyers who tried to use charm or intimidation in her courtroom. Looking at the judge's sharp eyes and compressed mouth, Margaret believed every story. Morton sat at the defendant's table with his expensive lawyer, a smooth-talking man from Denver, who'd arrived 2 days before the trial wearing clothes that probably cost more than Margaret's annual income. Morton himself looked diminished somehow, his usual commanding presence reduced by the simple fact of being accused. He wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes, she noticed, kept his gaze fixed straight ahead as if she didn't exist. The prosecution was handled by the territorial attorney, a competent if uninspiring man named Wallace, who'd interviewed Margaret and Daniel extensively in the weeks leading up to trial. He'd been skeptical at first. Margaret had seen it in his expression when she'd first told her story. But the physical evidence and the written confession from Morton's hired men had convinced him. This was a case he could win, and winning cases against wealthy ranchers made careers. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Eleanor Blackwood," the bailiff announced, and the courtroom rustled to its feet. Judge Blackwood entered with measured steps and took her seat, her eyes sweeping the crowded room with an expression that suggested she found the spectacle distasteful but expected. "Be seated. We're here for the matter of the territory versus Caleb James Morton, who stands accused of conspiracy to commit arson, attempted theft of livestock, and conspiracy to commit fraud through intimidation. Mr. Wallace, you may begin." The prosecutor stood, buttoning his jacket with deliberate precision. "Your Honor, members of the court, this is a case about greed masquerading as inevitability. The defendant, Mr. Morton, is a wealthy and established rancher who decided that his neighbor's misfortune was his opportunity. When Mrs. Margaret Wells was widowed last spring, Mr. Morton began a campaign of intimidation and sabotage designed to force her from her land so he could purchase it at a fraction of its value. We will prove through physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, and the defendant's own hired men that Mr. Morton orchestrated a barn fire that destroyed Mrs. Wells' property and later attempted to scatter her livestock through fence cutting and planned cattle rustling. This was not business competition. This was not free market negotiation. This was criminal conspiracy, plain and simple." Wallace's opening was workmanlike but effective. He laid out the timeline clearly, established Morton's motive through documented offers to buy Margaret's land, and previewed the testimony to come. When he finished, Morton's lawyer rose with the kind of theatrical flourish that made Margaret's teeth clench. "Your Honor, my name is Cornelius Fitzpatrick, and I represent Mr. Morton in this unfortunate matter. Unfortunate because my client, a pillar of this community and a man of unimpeachable character, finds himself accused of crimes based on the word of common criminals and the suspicions of a widow who, and I say this with all sympathy, may be overwhelmed by circumstances beyond her understanding." Fitzpatrick's voice dripped false compassion. "We will show that Mr. Morton had no involvement whatsoever in the alleged crimes, that the men who committed these acts were rogue elements acting on their own initiative, and that any connection to my client is purely circumstantial and the product of desperate imagination rather than fact." Margaret felt Daniel tense beside her at the phrase desperate imagination, but he said nothing, merely reached over and briefly squeezed her hand in silent support. The gesture steadied her, reminded her that she wasn't alone in this room full of watching eyes and whispered speculation. The prosecution called its first witness, Sheriff Coleman, who testified about finding the 3 men in the act of cutting Margaret's fence, about the physical evidence collected, and about the verbal confession made on site. Fitzpatrick tried to undermine him on cross-examination, suggesting the confession was coerced or that the men might have been lying to save themselves, but Coleman held firm. Those men confessed freely and were quite specific about Mr. Morton's involvement, Coleman said, his voice flat and factual. They named him by name, described meetings where he'd given them instructions, and provided details about payment that we later verified through bank records. Mr. Morton can't explain away. Next came John Hendricks, who described watching the fence cutting through his spyglass and identifying the branded cloth one of the men had dropped. Fitzpatrick tried to suggest Hendricks had a financial interest in supporting Margaret, perhaps hoping to buy her land himself if Morton was removed as competition, but Hendricks shut that down immediately. "I don't want Mrs. Wells' land, Mr. Fitzpatrick. I have plenty of my own. What I want is to live in a community where widows aren't terrorized by wealthy men who think power gives them the right to destroy what they can't buy." Hendricks looked directly at Morton. "I've known Caleb Morton for 15 years. Used to respect him. But what he did to that woman crossed every line of decency, and I won't pretend otherwise to save his reputation." The courtroom stirred at that, a ripple of reaction that Judge Blackwood silenced with a single sharp look. "Order. Continue, Mr. Wallace." Then came the 3 hired men, brought from jail in chains. They'd been promised reduced sentences in exchange for truthful testimony, and they delivered. The youngest, a man named Billy Cooper, who couldn't have been more than 20, described in painful detail how Morton had approached them at a saloon, how he'd outlined his plan, how he'd paid them in advance for the barn fire with instructions to make it look accidental. "He said nobody would believe a woman over him," Cooper testified, his voice shaking slightly. "Said she'd fold under pressure and sell cheap, and we'd get another payment when she did. When the fire didn't break her, he got angry. That's when he told us to go after the cattle, to make it look like she couldn't protect her stock." "And did Mr. Morton ever express concern about Mrs. Wells' welfare?" Wallace asked. "About whether these actions might harm her?" "No, sir. He talked about her like she was an obstacle, not a person. Said women had no business running ranches anyway, that he was just helping nature take its course." Cooper finally looked at Margaret, his expression miserable. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We needed the money, and we didn't think about what it meant to you. That was wrong." Fitzpatrick's cross-examination was aggressive, trying to paint Cooper and his companions as unreliable criminals who would say anything for a lighter sentence. But their stories were too consistent, too detailed, and corroborated by too much physical evidence to be dismissed. By the time the third man had testified, confirming everything the others had said, even Fitzpatrick looked like he knew he was fighting a losing battle. Then Wallace called Daniel to the stand. Margaret watched him walk to the witness box with that same steady confidence he brought to everything. No swagger, no hesitation, just a man prepared to tell the truth and let it stand on its own weight. He was sworn in, stated his name and occupation, and settled into the chair with his hands folded calmly in his lap. "Mr. Cross," Wallace began, "please describe your employment relationship with Mrs. Wells." "I'm her ranch manager and general laborer. I handle the heavy work, maintenance, livestock management, and property security." Daniel's voice was clear and measured. "I've been employed by her for approximately 3 months. And in that capacity you were present the night Mrs. Wells's barn burned?" "I was. I slept in her house that night, in the parlor, with her permission, because we'd received a threatening note several days earlier. I wanted to be closer in case of trouble." Daniel described waking to the smell of smoke, getting the animals out, fighting the fire. His testimony was factual, unemotional, but Margaret could see the jury leaning forward, engaged by his obvious competence and honesty. Wallace walked him through the investigation that followed, the decision to use the cattle as bait, the night they'd caught Morton's men in the act. Daniel's recall was precise, times, positions, exact words spoken. It was the testimony of someone who'd been paying very close attention because he'd known it would matter. "Mr. Cross," Wallace said, approaching a crucial point, "you're relatively new to this territory. You have no prior relationship with Mrs. Wells beyond your employment. Why involve yourself so deeply in this situation? Why not simply leave when trouble started?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, his eyes finding Margaret's across the courtroom. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that silenced even the whispers in the back rows. "Because I've spent most of my life watching people in power destroy people without it, and I got tired of watching. Mrs. Wells was alone and vulnerable, and men like Morton. He glanced at the defendant for the first time. Men like him see that as opportunity instead of tragedy. But being vulnerable doesn't mean being weak, and being alone doesn't mean deserving to be victimized. I stayed because she deserved someone to stand with her, and because I wanted my daughters to see that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Fitzpatrick seemed momentarily at a loss for how to counter that simple, devastating honesty. When he finally rose for cross-examination, his usual bombast was notably muted. "Mr. Cross, you're a drifter by your own admission, a man with no permanent home, no deep roots in this community. Isn't it possible that you saw an opportunity in Mrs. Wells' vulnerability? A chance to secure employment? Perhaps even more than employment, by making yourself indispensable?" "I'm employed by Mrs. Wells, yes. That's not a secret." Daniel's expression didn't change. "As for the rest of your insinuation, I'll say this plainly. My interest in Mrs. Wells' welfare is professional and personal, but it's also honorable. I've never taken advantage of her situation, never asked for more than fair wages, and never suggested anything inappropriate. If you're implying I orchestrated this entire situation to somehow benefit myself, you'll need to explain how burning down a barn and risking my employer's livestock serves my interests. Perhaps you saw Mr. Morton as competition. Perhaps you hope to eliminate him and position yourself as what?" Daniel's voice sharpened slightly. "As a landowner? I have no money to buy land, Mr. Fitzpatrick. As a suitor? Mrs. Wells has given me no indication she desires that, and I've made no advances. Your theory requires me to be either a criminal mastermind or a con artist, and the evidence shows I'm neither. I'm a man who does honest work for honest pay, and who happened to be present when your client tried to destroy an innocent woman's livelihood." Fitzpatrick abandoned that line of questioning quickly, trying instead to poke holes in Daniel's observations from the night they'd caught the fence cutters. But Daniel's recall remained unshakable, and eventually Fitzpatrick sat down with visible frustration. Finally, Wallace called Margaret herself to the stand. She walked forward on legs that felt steadier than she'd expected, was sworn in, and took her seat facing a courtroom full of people who'd been judging her for months, some sympathetic, some skeptical, all waiting to hear her tell her own story in her own words. Wallace began gently, establishing her background, her marriage to Thomas, his death, her struggle to maintain the ranch alone. Then he moved to Morton's involvement, the offers to buy that had become increasingly insistent, the rumors she'd heard about her inevitable failure, the threatening note, the barn fire. "Mrs. Wells, can you describe what you lost in that fire?" Margaret took a breath, steadying herself. "All my winter hay, all my tools and equipment that couldn't be salvaged, saddles, harnesses, spare parts for equipment, seed stores for spring planting. In monetary terms, probably $1,500 worth of property. In practical terms, nearly everything I needed to survive the winter and plant crops in spring. And yet you didn't sell to Mr. Morton after the fire. Why not?" "Because selling would mean he won. It would mean that terrorizing women works, that burning someone's property is an effective negotiation tactic. I couldn't live with myself if I taught my community that lesson." Margaret looked directly at Morton, forcing him to meet her eyes for the first time. "And because this is my land. My husband built it from nothing, and he trusted me to keep it. I don't break trust, Mr. Wallace. Not for money, not for ease, and certainly not for a man who thinks widows are easy targets." The courtroom erupted in scattered applause before Judge Blackwood's gavel silenced it. "Order! I will clear this courtroom if there are further outbursts. Continue, Mr. Wallace." Wallace walked her through the rest, the cattle bait plan, the fear she'd felt waiting for Morton's next move, the relief when his men were finally caught. Throughout it all, Margaret kept her voice steady, her facts clear. This wasn't about emotion, though emotion certainly ran beneath every word. This was about establishing truth through testimony that couldn't be dismissed or undermined. Then Fitzpatrick rose for cross-examination, and Margaret braced herself. "Mrs. Wells, you're an educated woman. You can read and write, manage accounts, handle business matters. Is that correct?" "Yes." "Then surely you understand that running a ranch of your property's size typically requires skills and physical capabilities that, and I mean no offense, are difficult for a woman alone to provide. Wouldn't you agree?" I'd agree that it's difficult for anyone alone, man or woman. That's why people hire help, form partnerships, and build communities. Gender doesn't determine capability, Mr. Fitzpatrick. Circumstance and support do. But you were struggling before Mr. Cross arrived, were you not? Behind on repairs? Overwhelmed by the work? I was managing. Yes, it was difficult. Yes, I needed help. That's why I hired Mr. Cross when the opportunity arose. Needing help doesn't equal failing, and it certainly doesn't justify what your client did. Fitzpatrick shifted tactics. Mrs. Wells, you've painted my client as a villain, but isn't it true that Mr. Morton made you several generous offers to purchase your land? Offers that would have solved your financial difficulties? He made offers, yes. I don't know that I'd call them generous. Below market value, certainly, especially after the fire that he orchestrated specifically to devalue my property. Margaret felt her anger rising and forced it down, keeping her voice level. And even if his offers had been generous, I wasn't selling. My refusal was clear and repeated. What followed wasn't business negotiation. It was retaliation. You're asking this court to believe that a respected rancher, a man who's contributed to this community for decades, would risk everything to acquire your specific property. Why? What makes your land so valuable that he'd resort to crime? You'd have to ask Mr. Morton that, but I suspect it's not about the land's value. It's about his pride. I said no to him. Women don't say no to Caleb Morton, so he decided to make me an example. Margaret leaned forward slightly. You want to know why he did it? Because he could. Because he thought no one would believe me over him. Because he's gotten away with behavior like this before and assumed he'd get away with it again. That's a serious accusation. It's a serious crime he committed, Mr. Fitzpatrick. The accusations match the severity. Fitzpatrick tried several more angles, but Margaret held firm, refusing to be rattled or led into contradictions. By the time he finally dismissed her, she felt drained but satisfied. She'd told her truth clearly and completely, and now it was in the judge's hands. The final witness was the bank manager, who confirmed that Morton had made several large cash withdrawals in the months leading up to the barn fire and attempted cattle rustling, withdrawals that matched the amounts the hired men testified they'd been paid. It was the last piece of the evidentiary puzzle, the financial trail that connected Morton directly to the crimes. Closing arguments were predictable. Wallace hammered the evidence, physical, testimonial, and financial, into a comprehensive picture of deliberate criminal conspiracy. Fitzpatrick tried valiantly to create reasonable doubt, suggesting alternative explanations and attacking the credibility of the hired men, but even he seemed to sense it was futile. The evidence was too strong, too consistent, too damning. Judge Blackwood listened to both arguments with an expression that revealed nothing, made notes in her precise handwriting, and then sat back in her chair with her hands folded. This court will take a brief recess before rendering judgment. We'll reconvene in 1 hour. The courtroom emptied slowly, people clustering in conversation, speculation running rampant about what the judge would decide. Margaret stepped outside into winter sunshine that felt blindingly bright after the dim courtroom, and Daniel followed her, positioning himself slightly between her and the crowd in that protective way he had. "You did well in there," he said quietly. "Better than well? You were remarkable." "I was angry," Margaret admitted. "Tried not to show it too much, but it was there." "Righteous anger, that's allowed." Daniel glanced back at the courthouse. "She'll rule against him. I'd bet everything I own on it." "You don't own much," Margaret said, and surprised herself by almost laughing. "True, but I'd still bet it." They waited out the hour in relative silence, neither wanting to discuss what would happen next, what verdict would mean for Margaret's future, for Daniel's employment, for the strange household they'd built together over 3 months. Finally, the bailiff called them back inside, and they returned to their seats as the courtroom filled again. Judge Blackwood entered, took her seat, and surveyed the assembled crowd with stern authority. "I've considered the evidence and testimony presented in this matter, and I'm prepared to render judgment. Mr. Morton, please stand." Morton rose on visibly shaking legs, his lawyer beside him. For the first time, he looked genuinely afraid, the confident veneer finally cracking to reveal the desperate man beneath. "Mr. Caleb James Morton." Judge Blackwood's voice rang clear and cold through the silent courtroom. "This court finds you guilty on all charges. The evidence against you is overwhelming and your actions reprehensible. You used your wealth and influence to terrorize a widow, to destroy her property, and to attempt theft of her livestock. You hired men to commit crimes on your behalf, and then attempted to evade responsibility when those crimes were discovered. Your behavior represents the worst kind of abuse of power, and this court will not tolerate it. Morton swayed slightly but remained standing, his face gone gray. I hereby sentence you to 5 years hard labor in the territorial prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years if your behavior warrants it. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution to Mrs. Margaret Wells in the amount of $2,000 to cover the property you destroyed and the damages you caused. Your ranch assets will be liquidated as necessary to satisfy this judgment. If restitution is not paid within 60 days, additional property seizure will commence. Judge Blackwood paused, letting that sink in. Furthermore, you are permanently enjoined from contacting Mrs. Wells or entering her property for any reason. Violation of this order will result in additional criminal charges. The gavel came down with finality. This court is adjourned. The courtroom exploded into noise, gasps, conversations, a few scattered cheers quickly silenced by the bailiff. Margaret sat frozen, barely able to process what had just happened. Guilty. On all charges. 5 years. $2,000. It was more than she'd hoped for, more than she'd dared to expect. Daniel's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "It's over," he said quietly. "You won." "We won," Margaret corrected, her voice thick with emotion she couldn't quite name. "I couldn't have done this without you." Morton was being led away in chains, his lawyer already talking urgently about appeals that probably wouldn't matter. The man who'd tried to destroy her was broken, ruined by his own greed and by the justice system that had actually, miraculously, worked the way it was supposed to. People approached to congratulate her, John Hendricks clapping her shoulder with genuine pride, Sheriff Coleman nodding his approval, even some townspeople who'd been skeptical before now, offering awkward but sincere support. Margaret accepted it all in a daze, still struggling to believe it was real, that the months of fear and struggle had actually ended in vindication. Outside the courthouse, standing in winter sunshine that seemed brighter than before, Margaret finally let herself feel the full weight of relief. Her land was safe. Her enemy was defeated. The rumors that had followed her for months would be replaced by a new story, the story of a widow who'd stood her ground and won. "Mrs. Wells," a young man approached, hat in hand. "I'm a reporter for the Helena Independent. Would you be willing to answer a few questions about your case? People are calling it a landmark judgment, a woman successfully defending her property rights against a powerful man." "That's news." Margaret glanced at Daniel, who gave her an encouraging nod. "All right," she said, "but make sure you get it right. This wasn't about me being a woman. It was about me being a person who refused to be victimized. That distinction matters." The reporter scribbled notes enthusiastically. "What would you say to other women in similar situations? Other widows facing pressure or intimidation?" Margaret thought about her answer carefully. "I'd say that you're stronger than you think you are. That asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. That the law, for all its flaws, can actually work if you're brave enough to use it, and that men like Caleb Morton depend on your fear and isolation. Don't give them either. Find people you can trust, stand your ground, and fight like hell for what's yours." The reporter wrote furiously, then looked up with eyes that suggested he recognized the significance of what she'd said. "Thank you, Mrs. Wells. This will run in tomorrow's edition." As he left, Daniel turned to Margaret with something like pride in his expression. "You're going to be famous, the widow who took down Caleb Morton." "I'm going to be notorious," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference, but right now, I don't care. Right now, I just want to go home." "Then let's go home." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, arriving as the sun was setting and painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. Lila and Rose came running from the bunkhouse the moment they heard the horses, their faces anxious with waiting. "What happened?" Rose demanded. "Did they put him in jail?" "They did," Margaret confirmed, dismounting. 5 years in prison, and he has to pay me $2,000 for what he destroyed." Both girls whooped with joy, dancing around each other in a celebration that made Margaret smile despite her exhaustion. Daniel watched his daughters with an expression of such fierce love that Margaret felt something twist in her chest. Not pain, exactly, but recognition of how much this man had to lose, how much he risked every day by staying here with her. That evening, after a celebratory dinner that Mrs. and Hendricks had helped prepare, after the twins had finally gone to bed, still chattering excitedly about justice and victory, Margaret and Daniel sat on her porch in the cold night air, wrapped in blankets and watching stars emerge in a sky so clear it seemed infinite. "What happens now?" Daniel asked quietly. "With the ranch? With your plans?" "I rebuild the barn, pay off my debts with Morton's restitution money. Maybe hire another hand for the heavy work come spring." Margaret paused. "And I keep you employed, if you're willing to stay." "I'm willing." He said it simply, but something in his voice suggested there was more he wanted to say. "Daniel," Margaret began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was thinking. "These past 3 months they've changed everything. You changed everything. And I need you to know that whatever comes next, whatever we decide about the future, I'm grateful. For your work, yes, but also for your presence. For your daughters. For the way you made my house feel less empty." He was quiet for a long moment, his profile sharp against the starlit sky. "Margaret, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have said before, but didn't know how." She waited, her heart suddenly hammering. "I told you I came here because I'd heard about you, because I thought you might be someone worth knowing. That was true, but it wasn't complete." He turned to face her fully. "I stayed because somewhere in the watching and the working and the daily proximity, I stopped seeing you as a worthy cause and started seeing you as just you. Margaret, the woman who sings in the barn and checks fence lines at dawn and refused to break even when breaking would have been easier. And I realized that what I felt wasn't just respect or admiration, it was—" He stopped, struggling for words. "It was more than that." Margaret's breath caught. "Daniel, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "Your husband's been dead less than a year. You're not ready for whatever I might be suggesting. I know that, but I needed you to know that my reasons for staying aren't purely professional anymore. They're personal. They've been personal for weeks now, if I'm honest." The confession hung between them in the cold air, weighted with possibility and complication. Margaret knew she should probably be shocked, or at least surprised, but she wasn't. The truth was, she'd felt it too. The shift from employer and employee to something more nuanced, more intimate. The way her heart lifted when she heard his voice in the morning. The way his presence had become essential rather than convenient. "I'm not ready," she said slowly, "for whatever comes after this conversation. You're right about that. Thomas," her voice caught on his name. "I loved him. I still love him, in the way you love someone who shaped your life. And I need time to figure out who I am without him before I can figure out who I might be with someone else." "I understand," Daniel said, and sounded like he genuinely did. "But," Margaret continued, "I'm also not blind or stupid. I know what's been growing here between us, and I know that time changes things, that grief eventually makes room for other feelings." She met his eyes. "So I'm asking you to be patient, to stay, to work, to let your daughters keep weaving themselves into my life, to let me have the time I need to become someone ready for more." "How much time?" Daniel asked quietly. "I don't know, months? Maybe longer. Is that fair to ask?" "Margaret, I've been drifting for 5 years. I can wait a few more months if it means I'm drifting towards something real instead of just away from loneliness." He smiled slightly. "Besides, my daughters adore you. Leaving would break their hearts more than mine." "Liar," Margaret said, but gently. "They'd survive. You, though, you're invested now." "I am," he admitted. "Completely invested. In this land, in this life, in—" He paused. "In you. So yes, I'll wait. I'll work. I'll be whatever you need me to be until you're ready for me to be more." They sat together in companionable silence, not touching, but close enough that Margaret could feel his warmth beside her, and she thought about futures that had seemed impossible 3 months ago. She thought about trust earned gradually through shared work and crisis. She thought about 2 small girls who'd knocked on her door and offered her a gift she hadn't known she needed. Not just their father's help, but the possibility of family, of belonging, of home being something built rather than inherited. The land stretched out before them in darkness, but Margaret could picture it all. The fence lines Daniel had mended, the cattle grazing peacefully, the space where the barn would be rebuilt come spring. Her land, her legacy, her future, whatever shape it took. And for the first time since Thomas died, that future didn't look like a burden to be survived. It looked like possibility. Winter settled over the ranch with surprising gentleness after the trial, as if the land itself recognized that Margaret had weathered enough storms for 1 year. The snow came in soft falls rather than blizzards, and the temperature held steady enough that the livestock thrived without excessive loss. Daniel worked through December rebuilding the barn with help from John Hendricks and his son, their hammers ringing out in rhythms that became as familiar as heartbeats. Margaret managed the books and watched her accounts slowly shift from red to black as Morton's restitution money arrived in installments, each payment a small vindication. The twins flourished in ways that made Margaret's heart ache with unexpected tenderness. They'd begun calling her Miss Margaret instead of Mrs. Wells, a small shift that felt significant. Rose had started leaving drawings tucked under Margaret's coffee cup each morning, crude sketches of horses and mountains and people holding hands that Margaret carefully preserved in a box she kept by her bed. Lila had taken to following Margaret around during evening chores, asking endless questions about ranch management and bookkeeping and whether women could own banks if they wanted to, because Lila thought she might want to own a bank someday. "You can own anything you're willing to work for," Margaret told her one evening while they fed the chickens. "Gender doesn't determine capability. It never has, no matter what some people claim." "That's what Papa says too," Lila replied, scattering grain with practiced efficiency. "He says the world tells women they can't do things, and then acts surprised when women prove the world wrong." "Your father is a wise man." "He's also lonely," Lila said with the blunt honesty of children. "He tries to hide it, but Rose and I notice. He smiles more around you, Miss Margaret. Did you know that?" Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks despite the cold air. "Lila, that's not... You shouldn't... I'm just saying what's true. Papa taught us not to lie, even when truth is uncomfortable." Lila looked up with those dark eyes that seemed far too knowing for a 6-year-old. "You smile more around him too." "Rose and I think that's good. We think maybe lonely people should stop being lonely if they can help it." Before Margaret could formulate a response that wouldn't encourage this line of conversation while also not dismissing the child's observations, Daniel's voice called from the barn. "Lila, need your eyes on this measurement." Lila ran off, leaving Margaret standing among the chickens with her thoughts in disarray. The child was right, of course. Margaret did smile more lately, did feel lighter, less burdened by the weight of solitary responsibility. But acknowledging that felt like betraying Thomas somehow, like admitting that life could continue and even improve without him. She finished with the chickens and returned to the house, where she found Rose at the kitchen table laboriously copying letters from one of the primers Daniel used for the twins' education. The girl looked up as Margaret entered, her face brightening. "Miss Margaret, how do you spell belonging? Papa said to ask you because you're good with complicated words." Margaret spelled it out, watching Rose write each letter with careful precision. "What are you writing?" "A story about a girl who doesn't have a home until she finds people who want her around." Rose bit her lip in concentration. "Papa says all good stories are really about belonging, even when they pretend to be about other things." "Your father says a lot of wise things." "He thinks them first, though, sometimes for a long time before he says them out loud." Rose glanced up. "I think he's been thinking about belonging a lot lately, about whether we really belong here or if we're just visiting." The question in her voice was unmistakable. Margaret pulled out a chair and sat down beside the child, choosing her words carefully. "Rose, you and your sister and your father are not visitors. This is your home for as long as you want it to be. Do you understand that?" "Even if..." Rose stopped, struggling with something. "Even if things change, even if Papa and you..." She couldn't quite finish the thought, but Margaret understood what she was asking. "Even then," Margaret said firmly, "whatever happens between your father and me, whether things stay as they are or become something different, you girls are part of my life now. That doesn't change." Rose's smile was blinding in its relief and joy. She threw her arms around Margaret's neck in an impulsive hug that caught Margaret off guard and filled her chest with an emotion she couldn't quite name. When had these children become so essential? When had their happiness become tangled up with her own? Christmas arrived with unusual warmth, not in temperature, but in atmosphere. Margaret had spent previous Christmases going through motions, marking the holiday because tradition demanded it, but finding little joy in celebrations meant for families she no longer had. This year felt different. She and the twins made decorations from pine branches and ribbons, filled the house with the smell of baking cookies, and planned a modest feast that somehow felt abundant anyway. On Christmas Eve, after the twins had gone to bed with stockings hung by the bunkhouse stove, Daniel knocked on Margaret's door carrying something wrapped in cloth. "I made something," he said, almost shy in a way she'd never seen him. "For you, for the house, technically, but just open it." Margaret unwrapped the cloth to reveal a wooden sign, beautifully carved and sanded smooth, with words burned into the surface in elegant script. Wells Ranch, founded 1889, defended 1891. Her throat tightened. "Daniel, I thought you should acknowledge what you did. What we did, but mostly what you did." His voice was quiet, but intense. "You defended this place. You earned the right to have that recognized." Margaret ran her fingers over the carved letters, feeling the care that had gone into each stroke. "When did you make this?" "Nights, mostly, after everyone was asleep. I wanted—" He paused, seeming to search for words. "I wanted you to have something permanent, something that marked this as yours beyond just legal papers. A declaration." "It's perfect," Margaret said, meaning it. "Thank you, for this and for—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything she couldn't articulate. "For everything." They stood in her doorway, the space between them charged with things unsaid, and Margaret felt the pull of possibility so strongly it frightened her. It would be easy to close that distance, to let whatever was building between them finally break through into something undeniable. But easy wasn't the same as right, and she'd promised herself she'd take the time she needed. "I should go," Daniel said, recognizing the moment for what it was. "Early morning tomorrow, and the girls will be up at dawn." "Daniel, wait." Margaret caught his arm as he turned. "I need you to know, I'm trying, to be ready, to become someone who can accept what you're offering. It's just taking time," he finished for her. "I know, Margaret, and I meant what I said about waiting. I'm not going anywhere." After he left, Margaret hung the sign above her fireplace where she could see it from her favorite chair, and she thought about declarations and defenses and what it meant to claim something as truly yours. The ranch was hers legally, yes, but it was becoming hers in deeper ways too, shaped by her choices, defended by her courage, marked by her refusal to surrender. The new year arrived with clear skies and bitter cold that tested the barn's newly completed roof and found it solid. Margaret celebrated by paying off the last of her bank debt, walking into the Helena Bank with a check that represented months of careful management and Morton's forced restitution. The banker accepted it with surprise and grudging respect, updating her account status from probationary to good standing with strokes of his pen that felt like absolution. "You've done well, Mrs. Wells," he said, his tone suggesting he hadn't expected to be saying those words. "Better than most thought possible." "Better than most wanted possible, you mean," Margaret corrected. "But thank you. I'll continue to do well." She walked out of that bank with her head high and her shoulders straight, and she realized somewhere between the door and her horse that she'd stopped caring what most people thought. The people who mattered. Daniel, the twins, John Hendricks, the handful of neighbors who'd offered genuine support. Those people knew her worth. The rest were just noise. January brought the Helena Independent's follow-up story on her case, featuring her quote about women defending their property rights prominently in the opening paragraph. The article sparked letters from other widows across the territory, women facing similar pressures or dealing with similar struggles. Margaret answered each one personally, offering what advice she could and feeling a strange sense of purpose in the correspondence. She wasn't just defending her own land anymore. She'd become, inadvertently, a symbol of possibility for women who'd been told they couldn't survive alone. "You're famous," Daniel observed one evening, watching her seal her fifth letter of the day. I'm notorious, Margaret corrected, echoing what she'd said after the trial. There's a difference. Is there? He smiled slightly. Because from where I'm standing, you look like someone who matters, someone whose voice carries weight. I never wanted weight. I just wanted to keep my land. You can have both. In fact, you already do. Daniel moved to the window, looking out at the ranch that had become as much his home as hers over the past 5 months. The bank president was in town yesterday. Hendricks told me. He was asking questions about you, about whether your success was sustainable or just a lucky break. Margaret felt irritation flare. Let him ask. I'll prove it's sustainable through continued success. That's the only answer that matters. That's what I told Hendricks to tell him. Daniel turned back to her, his expression thoughtful. Margaret, have you thought about expansion? About what comes after survival? I've thought about stability, about maintaining what I have. But you have more resources now than you did 6 months ago, more credibility, more support. He crossed back to the table, pulling out a chair and sitting across from her. What if you didn't just maintain? What if you grew? Margaret studied him, seeing calculation in his eyes that suggested he'd been thinking about this for a while. What exactly are you proposing? There's land adjacent to yours on the western border, the Miller property. Old man Miller died last fall, and his children want to sell. It's not large, maybe 80 acres, but it includes water rights that would strengthen your position considerably. With Morton's restitution money mostly paying off debt, you could potentially secure a loan for the purchase if you had a solid business plan. You've researched this. I've thought about sustainability, about making sure what we've built here lasts. He paused on the word we've and then continued. The Miller land would give you security beyond just survival. It would give you actual prosperity. And it would make this ranch large enough to support... He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. Large enough to support what? Margaret prompted. Multiple families, Daniel finished quietly. If that ever became relevant. The implication hung between them, and Margaret felt her pulse quicken. He was talking about the future. Not just her future or his future, but a shared future that included expansion and growth, and the kind of planning you only did when you intended to stay. I'd need to see the land, Margaret said carefully. Assess its condition, verify the water rights, understand what I'd be taking on. I can arrange that. Miller's son is eager to sell. He's moving to California and wants to settle the estate quickly. We could ride out there tomorrow if the weather holds. They did exactly that, leaving the twins with Mrs. Hendricks and riding west toward the Miller property as the sun rose over mountains still white with snow. The land was good, not prime grazing but solid, with a creek running through it that fed into Margaret's existing water sources and gentle slopes that would support cattle well. The house was abandoned and needed work, but the barn was sound and there were improvements that could be built upon. Standing on a rise overlooking both the Miller property and her own ranch beyond it, Margaret felt something shift in her understanding of her own possibilities. She'd spent so long focused on defense, on holding what she had, that she'd forgotten about advancement, about building something larger than survival. What do you think? Daniel asked, his horse shifting beside hers. I think it's ambitious, and expensive, and risky. Margaret paused. I think it's exactly what I should do. His smile was proud and warm. I was hoping you'd say that. They rode back making plans, discussing numbers and timelines and what would need to happen to make the purchase viable. Margaret found herself energized in a way she hadn't felt in months, her mind already cataloging improvements and calculating returns. This was more than just keeping what she had. This was actively building something larger, something that could sustain not just her, but a future she was only beginning to imagine clearly. February brought the loan approval from the bank, granted with conditions and higher interest than she would have liked, but granted nonetheless. Margaret signed the papers with Daniel as witness, and the Miller property became hers in a transaction that felt less like burden and more like possibility. They spent the rest of the month planning improvements, prioritizing repairs, and beginning the slow work of integrating the new land into the existing ranch operations. The twins celebrated the expansion by declaring themselves assistant property managers and drawing elaborate maps of the combined ranch that included fanciful elements like a library and a swimming pond, and in Rose's version, a house for Papa and Miss Margaret to share someday when they stop being scared. Margaret found that map tucked into her ledger one evening and stared at it for a long time, studying Rose's careful pencil strokes outlining a future the child saw as inevitable. Was she scared? Yes. Of making the wrong choice, of dishonoring Thomas's memory, of letting Daniel and his daughters into her heart only to lose them somehow. But she was also tired of being scared, tired of letting fear dictate her decisions. That night she sought out Daniel where he sat on the bunkhouse porch mending a bridle by lamplight. He looked up as she approached, surprise and something else crossing his face. "Margaret, everything all right?" "I found Rose's map," she said without preamble. "The one with the shared house." Daniel's expression shifted into chagrin. "I told her that was presumptuous. I'm sorry. Don't apologize. She's not wrong." Margaret climbed the steps to stand before him, her heart hammering but her resolve firm. "She's just earlier than I expected to be. But Daniel, I'm tired of taking time. I'm tired of being cautious and careful and afraid of what comes next." He set down the bridle slowly, his full attention on her now. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying it's been almost a year since Thomas died. I'm saying I've grieved and I've struggled and I've rebuilt myself into someone different than I was. And that someone," she paused, gathering courage, "that someone has feelings for you. Real feelings, not just gratitude or convenience. And I think you deserve to know that instead of making you wait indefinitely for something I'm ready for now." Daniel stood, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. "Margaret, are you sure? Because once we step across this line, there's no going back to what we were before." "I don't want to go back. I want to go forward. With you." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the scratch of stubble under her palm, the warmth of skin that had become as familiar to her as her own. "If you'll have me. If you still want—" He kissed her, cutting off her words with a gentleness that surprised her given the intensity she saw in his eyes. It was a kiss that tasted like promise and possibility, and the kind of rightness that came from choosing someone with full knowledge of what you were choosing. When he pulled back, his hands cupped her face with reverence. "I'll have you," he said roughly. "In any way you'll let me. As partner, as wife, if you'll consent to it, as the person I build a future with. I'll have you, Margaret, and I'll consider myself the luckiest man alive for it." "Wife," Margaret repeated, testing the word. "You're proposing?" "I'm declaring intention. The actual proposal should probably involve my daughters, and something more romantic than a bunkhouse porch." His smile was crooked and endearing. "But yes, eventually, I'm proposing. If you're accepting." "Eventually, I'm accepting." Margaret leaned into him, feeling the solid strength of him against her, and thought about journeys that began with unexpected knocks on doors and ended with standing on porches choosing futures. "But Daniel, I need you to understand, this isn't me being rescued. This isn't me giving up independence for security. I know that. If I thought you needed rescuing, I'd have less respect for you than I do, and I respect you more than anyone I've ever known." He pulled back to look at her seriously. "This is partnership, Margaret. 2 people building something together because it's stronger than what either could build alone. That's all I've ever wanted." They stood together in the lamplight, making plans and promises in quiet voices, and somewhere inside the bunkhouse, Margaret heard the twins' muffled giggles suggesting they were absolutely not asleep as they were supposed to be and were probably listening to every word. "Your daughters are eavesdropping," Margaret observed. "Of course they are. I'd be disappointed if they weren't." Daniel raised his voice slightly. "And if 2 certain girls don't pretend to be asleep in the next 10 seconds, there will be extra chores tomorrow." Immediate sounds of rustling and exaggerated snoring came from within, and both adults laughed quietly. March brought the formal proposal, conducted with Lila and Rose's enthusiastic assistance in Margaret's kitchen over breakfast. Daniel presented her with a ring that had belonged to his mother, a simple gold band with a small sapphire that caught the morning light beautifully. The twins had drawn elaborate diagrams of the ceremony they thought should happen, complete with flower arrangements and what appeared to be a choir of chickens. "We can modify some of the details," Daniel said diplomatically, reviewing Rose's sketch. "Though I admit the chicken choir has a certain charm." They married in April in a small ceremony at the ranch, witnessed by John Hendricks and his family, Sheriff Coleman, and a handful of neighbors who'd proven themselves genuine in their support. Margaret wore a dress she'd made herself from fabric the twins had helped her choose, deep blue instead of white, because she was a widow remarrying and saw no need for false pretense. Daniel wore his only suit, cleaned and pressed with obvious care, and looked at her like she was the answer to questions he'd been asking his whole life. The vows were traditional, but felt revolutionary, spoken aloud in her ranch yard with her land spreading out behind them as witness. When Daniel slipped his mother's ring onto her finger and she placed a new gold band on his, Margaret felt something fundamental shift inside her. She was no longer Margaret Wells, widow and solitary defender of inherited land. She was Margaret Cross, wife and partner in a venture built through mutual choice rather than circumstance. The twins served as flower girls and took their duties with utmost seriousness, scattering petals with precision and standing as witnesses when the ceremony required it. Afterward, Rose leaned close to Margaret and whispered, "Now you're really our mama, right? Not just Miss Margaret?" Margaret's throat tightened with emotion. "If you want me to be." "We do," Lila said firmly, having clearly overheard. "We decided months ago. We were just waiting for you and Papa to figure it out." The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. Food shared among friends, music from John Hendricks' fiddle, dancing in the yard as the sun set and the first stars appeared. Margaret danced with Daniel, with Hendricks, with the twins who stood on her feet and let her waltz them around until they collapsed in giggles. She felt lighter than she had in years, as if the weight she'd been carrying had finally been redistributed across shoulders, willing to help bear it. As the guests departed and the twins finally collapsed into exhausted sleep in what was now their permanent bedroom in the main house, Daniel and Margaret stood on the porch watching the stars emerge in a sky so vast it seemed to hold infinite possibilities. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting against his chest. "For what?" "For taking a chance on a stranger and his daughters. For opening your door that night and your life in all the nights after. For being brave enough to trust when trusting was terrifying." He paused. "For choosing me." "You chose me first," Margaret pointed out. "You and those bold daughters of yours who knocked on my door and told me you loved me before we'd even met." "They weren't wrong." Daniel's voice held wonder. "I did love you, from watching you work and refuse to quit and stand up to forces larger than yourself. I loved your strength before I knew your face, and I loved your heart once I was lucky enough to see it. I'll love you for the rest of my life, Margaret Cross." That's not romantic poetry. It's simple fact. Margaret turned in his arms to face him. This man who'd appeared in her darkest hour and refused to leave even when leaving would have been easier. "I love you too. And your daughters. And the life we're building together. It's not the life I expected, but it's better than I could have imagined." They went inside together, climbing stairs to a bedroom that was now truly shared, and Margaret thought about journeys that began with endings and led through fire and conflict to new beginnings. Thought about two little girls brave enough to knock on a stranger's door. Thought about a man patient enough to wait while she found her way from grief to readiness. Thought about land defended and expanded and claimed not through birthright, but through choice and courage. The summer that followed was the most productive Margaret had ever experienced. The combined ranch flourished under their joint management, with Daniel handling the physical labor and Margaret managing the business aspects in a division of labor that played to their respective strengths. They hired 2 additional hands to help with the expanded property. Young men who treated Margaret with the same respect they gave Daniel, and seemed genuinely pleased to work for a woman who knew her business. The twins thrived, growing visible inches taller and gaining the kind of confidence that came from being genuinely loved and valued. Rose discovered a talent for working with horses that astonished everyone, gentling difficult animals with a patience and intuition beyond her years. Lila continued to insist she'd own a bank someday, and spent hours reviewing Margaret's ledgers, learning bookkeeping with a dedication that suggested she might actually achieve that ambition. By autumn, when the leaves turned gold and the air carried the first hints of coming winter, Margaret found herself standing once again on her porch, surveying her land. But the view was different now. The new barn stood proud and solid, larger than the one that had burned. The fence lines were straight and strong, marking boundaries that had been expanded and defended. Cattle grazed peacefully across pastures that had been hard-won and harder kept. Smoke rose from the bunkhouse where the hired hands lived, and from her own chimney where dinner cooked and her family waited. Her family. The phrase still surprised her sometimes with its accuracy and power. She had a husband now, daughters who called her mama without hesitation, a home that felt full instead of empty. She had prosperity beyond mere survival, security beyond simple defense. She had built something real and lasting, and she had done it not despite being a widow alone, but by refusing to stay alone, by accepting help when it was offered and love when it proved itself genuine. Daniel came out to join her as he often did at sunset, slipping an arm around her waist and pulling her close. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their land settle into evening, and Margaret felt a contentment so complete it bordered on disbelief. "Happy?" Daniel asked, knowing the answer but asking anyway. "Yes," Margaret said simply. "Happier than I thought possible." "Good, because I have news that might make you even happier, or possibly terrify you." He sounded amused and nervous at once. "We're going to need to expand the house." Margaret pulled back to look at him, confusion crossing her face. "Why? We have plenty of room for—" She stopped as understanding dawned. "Daniel, are you saying—" "A baby. Come spring if all goes well. The doctor confirmed it yesterday." His smile was brilliant with joy and wonder. "You're going to be a mother again, or for the first time, depending on how you count the twins." Margaret pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling nothing yet but imagining the life forming there, the future literally growing inside her. A baby. A child born of choice and love rather than duty or expectation. A symbol of the family they'd built from determination and unlikely circumstances. "I'm terrified," she admitted. "I know, so am I." Daniel pulled her close again. "But we'll figure it out, just like we figured out everything else, together." That night, they told the twins over dinner, and the girls' reactions were everything Margaret could have hoped for. Rose cried happy tears and immediately began planning how she'd teach the baby about horses. Lila declared herself Chief Baby Protection Officer and started making lists of supplies they'd need and rules that would have to be established. Both girls hugged Margaret with fierce protectiveness, and she realized they weren't worried about being replaced or losing importance. They were excited to gain another sibling, another person to love in their expanding family. Winter came again, the second winter since Daniel had arrived, but this time Margaret faced it with no fear. The barn was full of supplies, the house was warm and full of voices, and the future stretched ahead with clarity instead of uncertainty. She spent the cold months preparing for the baby, sewing tiny clothes with the twins' help, and transforming the small room off the master bedroom into a nursery that felt like hope made tangible. The baby arrived in May on a morning so beautiful it seemed orchestrated for new beginnings. A son, healthy and loud, with Daniel's dark eyes and Margaret's stubborn chin. They named him Thomas Daniel Cross, honoring both the past and the present, and Margaret held him in her arms and felt the final piece of her healing click into place. She had grieved Thomas Wells thoroughly and genuinely, had honored his memory through defending the land he'd built. But this new life, this child born of new love, represented something beyond grief, represented the possibility of building forward rather than just preserving backward. The twins adored their baby brother with an intensity that bordered on comical, fighting over who got to hold him and competing to make him smile. Daniel was a devoted father, rising for midnight feedings and walking the floor during fussy evenings with a patience that made Margaret's heart swell. And Margaret herself discovered that motherhood the second time around, chosen and prepared for, felt entirely different than she'd expected. More joyful, less frightening. Absolutely right. As summer settled over the ranch and Thomas Daniel grew from newborn to infant with astonishing speed, Margaret found moments to sit on her porch and simply exist in the life she'd built. The ranch prospered, her family thrived. The town that had once whispered about her now pointed to her as an example of success. And other women wrote asking for advice that Margaret gave freely, hoping to help others find the courage she'd had to fight for. One evening, with the baby asleep in his cradle, and the twins playing in the yard and Daniel working in the barn, Margaret took down the carved sign he'd made her and traced the words with her fingers. Wells Ranch, founded 1889, defended 1891. Below it, she'd recently added her own carving, burned carefully into the wood with Daniel's help. Cross Ranch. Built together, 1892. Two names, two families, one continuous story of survival and growth and refusal to surrender. She hung the sign back above the fireplace and stood back to admire it, this declaration of everything she'd fought for and everything she'd gained. A knock came at the door. Not the frantic knocking of that November night 2 years ago, but a gentle tap that proved to be John Hendricks bearing a basket of early vegetables from his wife's garden. "Thought you might want these for dinner," he said, handing over the basket. "And I wanted to tell you, there's talk of forming a territorial women's property rights association, and they're asking if you'd consider being on the founding board. Your story inspired it, apparently." Margaret took the basket, her mind already considering the implications. A formal organization to protect and advance women's property rights. A chance to ensure other widows didn't face what she'd faced, or at least faced it with better support. "Tell them yes," she said. "I'm interested." After Hendricks left, Margaret set about preparing dinner, her movements automatic and peaceful in her kitchen. Through the window, she could see Daniel returning from the barn with the twins flanking him, all three covered in dust and laughing about something. She could hear the baby stirring from his nap, making the small sounds that preceded crying. She could smell bread baking and see sunset painting the mountains in shades that reminded her why she'd fought so hard to keep this place. When Daniel and the twins came inside, bringing noise and energy and life with them, Margaret felt her heart swell with a gratitude so profound it nearly hurt. This was what she'd defended. Not just land or property or financial security, but the possibility of this loud, chaotic, imperfect, absolutely perfect family that had built itself from courage and patience and mutual choice. "Mama, can we have chicken for dinner?" Rose asked, already washing her hands at the basin. "Mama, Thomas is crying," Lila announced unnecessarily, heading toward the nursery. "Margaret," Daniel said quietly, stopping beside her to kiss her temple. "I love you." "I love you too," she replied, meaning it with every particle of her being. That night, after dinner was eaten and dishes were washed and children were finally asleep, Margaret and Daniel sat together in their bedroom, with lamplight casting soft shadows and the sounds of their family breathing peacefully around them. "Do you ever regret it?" Daniel asked suddenly. "Any of it? The struggle, the fear, the way it all happened?" Margaret considered the question seriously. "No, because the struggle made me stronger, the fear made me braver. And the way it happened, 2 little girls knocking on my door and announcing their father loved me. It was strange and unexpected and exactly what I needed." She leaned against him, feeling safe and valued and chosen. "You saved me, Daniel, you and your daughters." "No," he corrected gently. "You saved yourself. We just stood with you while you did it." Margaret smiled in the darkness, recognizing the truth in both statements. She'd saved herself through determination and refusal to quit, but she'd also been saved by others' willingness to help, to stand beside her, to love her when being alone would have been easier for everyone. The ranch that Thomas had built and she had defended had become something larger than either vision alone. It had become a home built by multiple hands and multiple hearts, defended not just through legal battles but through daily choice and commitment. It had become a place where 2 little girls who'd once been rootless now planted gardens with absolute confidence they'd be there to harvest them, where a man who'd drifted for years had finally found somewhere worth staying, where a widow had transformed grief into purpose and loneliness into belonging. Margaret closed her eyes and listened to her house settling around her, the creak of boards, the whisper of wind, the soft sounds of people she loved sleeping peacefully. This was victory. Not the courtroom judgment or the defeated enemy or the expanded property, though those mattered too. But this ordinary, extraordinary evening in a house full of life and love and possibility, this was what she'd really fought for. And she had won. Not rescued, but partnered. Not saved, but standing. Not alone on the plains with winter closing in, but rooted firmly with people beside her and a future bright enough to believe in. The knock that had changed everything had come on a cold November evening 2 years ago, delivered by 2 bold little girls who'd seen what she needed before she'd known herself. And what had followed, the work and the danger and the triumph, had built not just a successful ranch, but a family forged through fire and tested by adversity and proven absolutely unbreakable. Margaret Wells Cross fell asleep in her husband's arms, on her land, in her home, surrounded by her family, and dreamed not of survival, but of growth, not of defense, but of building, not of being alone, but of standing together. She dreamed of belonging. And when she woke with the dawn, ready to face another day of work and love and the thousand small choices that made a life, she woke smiling because the dream was real. It was real, and it was hers, and she had earned every single moment of it.